introduction. So welcome, everyone. I appreciate you being here. Our second agenda item is review and approval of the meeting agenda. I believe the agenda was sent out with the other materials. Everyone should have received it. Any discussion, or if there's no discussion, is there a motion to approve the meeting agenda? Second?
I second.
All in favor? Anyone opposed? All right, so our agenda is approved. The next item is review and approval of the minutes for our June 20th, 2014 commission meeting. Again, I believe that those minutes were distributed to the commission members. Is there any discussion of the minutes, or if there's no discussion, is there a motion? Motion with regard to the minutes? The second?
I second.
All in favor? Anyone opposed? So our minutes are approved. The next item on our agenda relates to accreditation and or laboratory updates. Brian, do you want to walk us through those?
Sure. Good morning. The first item on the agenda is the Erie County Medical Examiner's Office. There are several notifications regarding change of management. So the retirement of Dr. Bob Ostowitz, interim appointment, and then the appointment of Christine Griffin as the new lab director. Ms. Griffin's here up in Albany. And if there's any questions about that. Okay. Next item on the agenda is the New York City Office Chief Medical Examiner Forensic Toxicology Laboratory. They had their mid-cycle assessment. This is a self-assessment done by the lab halfway through their accreditation cycle. There's no vote required. It's for informational purposes, and that information has been provided in the binders. Dr. Stojic is on the commission and here if anyone has any questions. Okay. Next item on the agenda is the New York City Police Department Laboratory. There are two changes of management notifications. Diana Vargas was appointed to a new position as a criminalist manager, and Larry Presley was actually appointed to an existing position that vacated. And I believe Dr. O'Neill is in New York if anyone has any questions about that. Okay. Next item on the agenda is the New York State Police Crime Laboratory, and also they have a new appointment in Kelly Verkler, I believe is how you pronounce it, and also Julie Piscatetti in that particular case filling in for Barry Juiceman. So I don't know if there's any questions about that. Okay. Next item on the agenda is the Westchester County Crime Laboratory, the Division of Labs and Research. Essentially, we have Bob Adamo, the director of that laboratory here, and as part of a corrective action, they're looking to change the scope of their laboratory and actually remove the category of testing of glass. So in this particular case, I'm not sure if a vote is necessarily necessary or not. You know, we're going to be changing their certificate to not include glass anymore.
Do we have anyone from Westchester here?
Bob Adamo's down here.
He's in New York, Brian.
Bob, do you want to just explain to us what you want to do here and why? Thank you.
Yes, good morning. In reviewing our performance on our last class proficiency test, we realized that as part of the root cause analysis of our performance, that we just were not getting enough class cases to establish the experience we needed for proficiency in doing that type of analysis. And since we were accredited, we've only gotten one case, and that's, I think, almost 3 years. So our feeling is it's better to let the proficiency test just kind of show that we really shouldn't be doing that and not make a mistake on an actual case. So what we're going to do, I've already reached out to our DA's office and told them that if they need a case analyzed for glass, we'll find an accredited laboratory to do it. But at this time, I don't think we get enough cases to give us that experience level we need to be proficient in it. So I'd like to remove it.
Does anyone have any questions for Bob?
I think it makes a lot of sense. I'm just wondering, generally, who does glass in this state?
I'm not familiar with all the laboratories. That would probably be better addressed by DCJS.
I see a number of...
We currently do it. We're
as well as Bob, considering the same course of action.
That's the state police?
So I don't know if you heard that for the
Yeah, let's
record,
put
but
that in.
our friends from the New York State Police say that they do it, but they don't get many cases.
Not
and,
many cases, and we're going to be discontinuing as
Really?
well.
And they say they're going to be
Same issue.
discontinuing. And I saw, Bob, that you raised your hand for Suffolk. And what's the deal there?
Well, right now, we're going to continue doing it.
Do you get cases?
Yes.
And I'm just curious, is that because you will do automobile cases? Is that it?
Yes.
And is there anybody else that does automobile cases that has a certain amount of frequency in dealing with this?
New York City we have.
What?
New York City. What?
New York State.
Yeah, but we're also looking at the frequency as well. We're evaluating all of the services.
So I'm just curious. I mean, all of a sudden, everybody's saying there.
Just to be clear, I
Why?
want
I don't get it.
from the state police perspective, we do plan on continuing to do fracture match. We don't plan on continuing to do chemical analysis anymore.
And that's the same with us. We're still going to do, physical matches. For example, if there's a broken headlight and they find the car later on and we can get an actual physical match where it's an exact match, we're still doing that because that's one of the other aspects of trace evidence. We're just not doing the chemical and elemental comparisons of glass.
And that's because why?
We just weren't getting enough cases to become proficient.
Well, that I understood that completely.
Yeah.
But I guess if that's where everybody's going, I have sort of a question about it. You know, on the one hand, when you do your fracture comparisons, I would imagine that given all the new guidelines that are out there and are going to be coming out, if you were to say, oh, I see a fracture here and a fracture there, and they look similar to us, right? That opinion is going to be bounded on both sides with some discussion of what the scientific limitation is. I mean, you're not saying, therefore, I can tell you that.
Well, we're talking about physical matches.
Yeah,
They actually
no,
fit
I
right into
understand. You're
place.
just going to be making some comparison, and I think that there are guidelines coming out now, or certainly you'd be considering it, about how you bound a description of similarity, just as in the area of hair, right, and all these other pattern evidence areas. But what's striking, just on the face of it, is when you're talking about an actual chemical analysis of the glass, right? Just intuitively, that would strike one as potentially a more informative kind of analysis than just looking at the fractures. So I think it's of some concern that people, maybe we should have a glass central or something. I mean, are you planning to send that to a private entity?
Well, either
send
the
it to-
FBI or possibly companies
Okay.
or any other accredited laboratory.
All right. Interesting. Exactly.
All right, if there's no other questions, I'm just looking at the accreditation itself, which is in the binder under the Westchester Forensics tab. And as I'm reading the accreditation that we approved, it doesn't specifically say glass. So I don't know, from my perspective at least, I don't think there's a need to vote.
No, this is the new one. This has just been updated.
Oh, okay, all right, this one that we have is updated in anticipation of a vote?
This is ASCLD's. I pulled this from the website. So ASCLD has already changed it for them, and our certificate still says glass. We
All
have
right,
to.
then in that case, I would entertain a motion based on, Bob's statement to us that we remove glass from the accreditation, that the remainder of the accreditation would remain the same, that we just remove glass. Do we have a motion?
I'll make that motion.
So moved.
All right, do we have a second?
I'll second it if you
All
want a
right.
motion.
All in favor? Anyone opposed? There's a little bit of a delay. Barry and Marvin, were you voting in favor?
In favor.
Okay, thank you. It's a little delayed here, so it's,
Okay. The next item on the agenda is the Westchester County Department of Labs and Research, Division of Forensic Toxicology. And this is also a mid-cycle evaluation report, which is in your binders. If you have any questions, Chris Cording is available via telephone from the laboratory if there are any questions.
Yeah, I had a question.
Okay, I'm going to call him for Chris Corey.
Please.
Just a minute.
Toxicology.
Is this Chris Cording?
Yes, it is.
Hi, this is Kathy Levine. I have you on speakerphone at the commission meeting.
Hi, everybody. How are you?
How are you? Mr. Cording, it's Marvin Schechter, a member of the commission. I have a question for you about these ethanol QC charts.
Okay.
Am I right that what basically happened here was you had procedures in place, but they were ignored?
Basically, yes. What happened was we had Excel charts with Levy-Jennings graphs, and people weren't looking at the graphs. So if there was an error, it was easily missed. So we subsequently added conditional formatting to the charts. So if a bad number was put in, it's highlighted in red and crossed out so that the error is evident to all to see.
And do I take it that you're going to do some additional training in this area?
The training basically was to stress the importance of not only the analyst checking the number, but the reviewer looking at the numbers and looking at all the data, not just a running tab of numbers, but looking at a visual representation to make sure it falls within the range that's acceptable.
Prior to this incident, had you ever had a problem before with this particular procedure?
No.
And prior to this incident, had Askeladd Lab or any accrediting agency pointed out to you that you needed to change your training system or management system to deal with this?
No. And this was this incident had happened once before. It was very troubling for the senior management that the staff was rather laissez-faire about this. So we were very vehement in stressing that that's the improper attitude to have about what we're doing. So we went an extra step so that the data is right in everybody's face, and there's no way that someone cannot pay attention to it anymore. So this was not we've never had this problem in my tenure in this laboratory, which is over 20 years. I don't want to say it's generational, but
one last area. I noticed in the corrective action report that once you had all these findings, you reported them to the DA's office and the public defender. Am I correct?
Yes.
And how did you go about reporting it to the public defender? Did you report it to the Westchester County Legal Aid Society or the particular defender who had the case?
We contacted the DAs, and then they had the information on who was the public defenders for those particular cases.
And you were able to confirm that the DA, in turn, notified the public defender? Or they gave you the information, and you?
I assume that they did. The report, the actual results never changed, but we just wanted to be very transparent that there was an issue with the primary number, and we just wanted everyone to know what was going on. So there was no change in the actual reported values.
Okay. Thank you.
Okay.
All right, if there's no further questions, the next item on the agenda is a surveillance visit of the...
Okay, Kathy.
of the Yonkers Police Crime Laboratory. And the director, Colleen Lockhart, I know was stuck in the tunnel on the train, so I don't know if she was able to make it there or not. But even in lieu of that, in your binder, you can see there's the surveillance report.
Oh, she's here. She's here.
Oh, she's there.
She's here.
So,
He's right here.
so if anyone has any questions for Ms. Lockhart, she's available to answer them.
I have a question.
Sure.
So what happened here exactly? You had audit documents
Yes, we
And-
had audit documents.
and they were not being used, or they were not up to date?
No, we used all the audit documents
Right.
that we had. This was our first internal audit
Okay.
since our ISO accreditation. The only thing was we didn't do every question of the 300 and some odd questions in the guideline. We didn't go through each and every
I
one.
see.
And we were misunderstood that, and so now it's in our plan to go through each and every question.
So just a technical?
Yes.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Yep.
Thank you, if not, whole business.
All right, thank you. All right, that brings us to old business on our agenda. The first thing we have is the New York City Office of the Chief Medical Examiner, Department of Forensic Biology. And that relates to a letter from the DNA Subcommittee dated September 16th of 2014 with regard to low-copy DNA testing. My recollection is that at a prior meeting of the commission did take a vote, directed that, or asked that certain things be done by the DNA Subcommittee. And as I read this letter, I think this letter indicates that they've done what the commission has asked them to do. So any comment with regard to this item?
Yeah, I have a lot.
Okay.
Anybody here from the lab? I'm sorry? Oh, okay. Maybe you should sit over there, Gene. The first thing is that a number of us did attend the meeting where these questions were asked. And the decision was made. I think there was if I have it right, the first question was answered about the minimum quantity of DNA that must be present before low copy number testing is employed. And then there was a decision to go and have a visit to the laboratory to try to deal with the other issues. And the minutes of that meeting are available. I found the discussion very disappointing in a number of ways. First, we were all the people that came were extremely limited in terms of time in being able to make what I think are extremely important points. First of all, secondly, when the first question was put to the DNA subcommittee, it seemed that they interpreted the question as whether I believe it was you could do a low copy number test at 25 picograms, and a few of the DNA subcommittee members were answering, well, yeah, it's possible to do that. I do that all the time in, genetic testing. I can even get a result from, one cell or one molecule, which really was not the issue in terms of, A, the historical question of what went on at the different meetings with representations by Dr. Prince as to the minimum amount that could be safely tested using low copy number. And two, indicated to me that we had some members of the subcommittee there that were not appreciative that what actually has to go on in an analysis and validation of DNA testing in the forensic context is different. In particular, in terms of all the letters that I passed on and the different briefing from the case in the Southern District of New York and the opinions of experts, it should be evident that the principal complaint that we were making is that there's something that is called in the guidelines, federal guidelines, as an internal validity test. That is, has this laboratory ever done a validation study on samples, mixtures, as was presented by the case in the Southern District, of in that instance it was, I think, 14 or 16 picograms, I can't recall which, but below 25 picograms with a mixture of 3 people, when the only validation study that has ever been published, and it wasn't on samples replicating casework, it was on buccal swabs initially, was 50 picograms with mixtures of 2 people. So I see nothing in response here from the DNA subcommittee that indicates that an internal validation study as required by federal guidelines was ever done for this particular assay. And so as to questions 1, 2, and 3, I'm extremely disappointed by this kind of an answer because certainly some of us who are at least intelligent consumers of this technology, and Dr. Walsh, who was on the DNA subcommittee and is presently on our commission, who had expressed certain doubts about this, would be at least capable of understanding in greater detail an answer. Are there such studies? Where are they? Can we see them? Can they be produced to this commission? And were they considered? Even more troubling to me was that we brought to the attention of the DNA subcommittee the fact that Dr. Bedoli and Dr. Chakrabarty, who was a former member of the DNA subcommittee, who had passed upon this and has subsequently said that he was wrong and he has serious concerns about the low copy number assay, I asked them, the subcommittee, would you hear from them? Would you consider their opinions? Would you review them and respond to them? And these are people that whatever one thinks of them scientifically, I do not, I'm sure people here, including Larry Presley, right, because we all did this litigation and we're all involved in the development of this technology, I don't think that you can say that Dr. Bedoli or Dr. Chakrabarty are mercenaries, are people that are saying all these things because they're going to get money for being an expert witness. They have very serious and strongly held problems with this, as do other scientists. And I am telling you outright, that just looking at this, I do not believe from a management point of view, I have not seen any internal validation study on samples replicating casework that you're doing every day in the New York City Medical Examiner's Office that would pass validation. And the day of reckoning is going to come. Be very clear about this. National Institute of Standards and Technology has set up these organization of scientific area committees. DNA is part of it, and someday people are going to review this. Now, what I find extremely troubling, it's an Ebola. It is a cancer here that could be spreading. We are all on notice that this is not, in the view of many qualified people, validated, okay? And we are doing this testing, swabbing guns, the triggers on guns, taking very, very small amounts, and doing it every day. Now, I asked Eugene, and I'd ask you to address this. I think we had an informal discussion at the last meeting, and I asked, could you track, if it turns out that these critics, who are not insubstantial people, are right, okay? And could we go back and look at all the old cases, right, where you were doing low copy number testing at thresholds, let's just pick, below 20 picograms on mixtures? Could you produce all of those in a very simple way so they could be reevaluated?
I think the issue has been evaluated by the DNA subcommittee.
That's not my, please answer my question. My question, because you told me that you couldn't. You looked at me like I was crazy and it would be impossible.
I don't recall any informal discussion that you had mentioned.
Okay. So let's make it a formal question and answer. Could you, if it came to it,
yes,
go back and track for the district attorneys and the defense lawyers in this city and anybody else that you're doing testing for, could you go back and easily track those cases so they could be reevaluated? What would that entail?
What do you mean, wait,
Yes,
before you answer that question, what do you mean by could you
Yeah.
go back and track those cases? What exactly are you asking?
Very simply, Mike, we all know that, let's just take, for the sake of this question, because the exact parameters, when this is ultimately
I asked a
evaluated.
very focused question here, Barry. When you
Yes,
said
I asked a
track,
very
what are you
focused
talking
question.
about?
I asked,
What do you
the
mean?
question I asked, I'm very specific, all right? Could you tell us how many cases involving low copy number testing were reported out of the laboratory on samples of less than 25 picograms, where you were getting results from mixtures of more than 2 people? Could you do that if called upon? And how would you do it? How difficult would it be? That's my question, G.
I'm sure it can track it along with all the other cases that we've done exonerations on. So I do believe that we can do it. It's just going to take some time. We have obviously case reports, case records from every single requester that has requested us the low copy number, either for criminal casework, exonerations, or for anything. I'm sure we can make that happen should you want us to do that.
Just two more factual questions. Isn't it true that the low copy number testing profiles that you get are not eligible to be entered into the CODIS databank?
It's not eligible to be uploaded onto the NDIS, the national level, but it is definitely eligible to go into the state database.
Okay, so does everybody understand what we're saying here? The FBI does not regard this low copy number testing as sufficiently reliable to put into the federal database.
I think you're clouding.
Yeah, that's not what they're saying.
Clouding that.
That's not what they're saying,
Acceptance
Barry.
and national policy are two totally different things. The acceptance and policy are two totally different things. You're trying to say that policy has something to do with acceptance. That's your argument. That's perfectly fine. I cannot accept that as the argument. And you can go talk to it.
Hey, I can clarify that one for you, Barry. Essentially what happened is when you're looking at the data bank, that's a search tool. And essentially the profiles that are generated from LCN are not the most appropriate samples for search because they produce other potential candidate matches. But as far as direct comparison, they have made no statement whatsoever that it's not valid. They've never made that statement.
They won't accept DNA profiles
for a search
into
tool.
the NDIS data bank from low copy number, right?
As a search tool. But as far as direct comparisons, if you can show me a statement, I'd love to see it. They've never made it.
Well, all right. I mean, they're not. The answer to the question is they're not accepting it. All right. You're going to say, well, that's not because they've reached any kind of a judgment that is not adequately validated. It's just some kind of artifact on how they search. I'm troubled. I am telling you, I don't think this meets federal standards in terms of internal validation. I still would like to, I think for purposes of this committee, I would like to see the DNA subcommittee and or the laboratory produce for us the internal validation studies demonstrating that on casework, as opposed to the article, the one peer-reviewed article that I know of that deals with buccal swabs, right, and mixtures of 2 people at 50 picograms or below. Do you have an internal validation study on samples that are 25 picograms or below of mixtures of more than 2 people that show that you can do this correctly? Do you have such internal validation studies as defined by the federal government?
Now, before you answer that, I just want to put a little context to our
How can you not answer
discussion
that
here.
question?
No, I'm saying before he answers that, I think we need to put some context to this discussion. That we as a commission asked the subcommittee, after a lot of discussion about this issue, we boiled down the commission's concerns to 3 questions. And we spent a lot of time, hashing out exactly what the questions were that we wanted the subcommittee to answer. We sent them to them in writing. On June 2nd, we got a letter back from the DNA subcommittee, and, Barry, you talk about the federal guidelines in a federal case, and we're not here to decide the federal guidelines. We're not here to decide the issue in a federal case. And I think that is putting some confusion into this conversation. And secondly, let me finish. Secondly, you talk about people who you say don't have a bone in this fight. We have a number of people who I happen to think are very highly qualified people, with very good backgrounds who sit on the DNA subcommittee who truly don't have a bone in this fight. We referred these 3 questions to them, and on June 2nd, in response to our first question, they told us that the subcommittee unanimously found that, quote, scientifically, there was no lower limit in the quantity of DNA that must be present before LCN testing could be employed, unquote. They then went on to say that in order to respond to our second 2 questions, which I think were questions that came out of some concerns that Ann Walsh raised at the meeting, that they wanted to go and visit the laboratory, review the materials, and see exactly how the laboratory was doing the LCN testing. So in fact, that happened, and the subcommittee members went to the laboratory, were given access to the lab, were allowed to review whatever it is they felt they had to review. After doing that, they sent us a letter on September 16th indicating that after extensive discussion of their findings at the September 5th, 2014 meeting, the subcommittee concluded that in response to question 2, there have been no substantive changes made to the forensic biology LCN DNA standard operating procedures since its initial approval in 2005. In response to question 3, the subcommittee determined that any changes to the instrumentation or software that occurred in the LCN procedure since that initial approval have been sufficiently validated. In my mind, we referred these questions to the body that has scientific experts on it, that by our structure we're supposed to rely on in making these decisions. They, in my mind at least, were very thorough. They didn't just decide these things at a meeting. They literally went to the lab, to see firsthand exactly what's happening. And after doing that, they answered our questions.
All right, well, Mike, let me just be very clear about something. We're not here to decide anything in a federal case, right? But that litigation did spawn all kinds of information that were then passed on to this commission and in turn were passed on to the subcommittee. And I want to be very clear about this. I still do not have an answer, and I still have no document produced indicating that the New York City Office of Medical Examiner for LCN testing has done an internal validation study. I cited exactly what guideline requires that. And to be very concrete about it, we're talking about, have you done a validation study to show that you can get the correct answer on the samples that replicate casework? All right? And this is exactly what they're doing. We only have one peer-reviewed published article. What I see in response from the DNA subcommittee here to these questions is that they say there have been no substantive changes in the standard operating procedure. And, the changes to instrumentation and software are sufficiently validated. But that's, frankly, not an answer to the question that I tried to raise. I've raised as specifically as possible, that I have great confidence are really the standard in the field. Where is that internal validation study? It looks to me like they don't have one, all right? And I think that that is treacherous and extraordinarily dangerous. I will tell you right now, I'm disturbed that we are now using LCN for state database comparisons when the federal government will not use it for ENDAS comparisons. And you can say all you want that that's just a technical glitch and it does not represent a failure to have the internal validation study. That's a matter that we'll see about in the future. But what I'd like to see that study. I am telling you, I attended that meeting. I listened to the discussion. It was about the first answer about whether, in theory, you can get a DNA result using low copy or any other technique at below 25 picograms. It was not a comforting discussion. I continue to be deeply troubled by the failure to respond, to failure of the subcommittee to even consider the opinions of people like Chakrabarty, who was a member who initially approved this and said this is wrong. This letter, this pro forma letter that just says we looked at everything and everything's fine, without specifically engaging or responding to the substance or even the opinions of these individuals, is troubling. This is not the kind of answer that you would expect if you were even a patient in the internet age that was asking for what kind of testing procedures are you using, what kind of operation am I about to undergo, what kind of chemotherapy or other kinds of things am I doing, what are the risks, what are the dangers, what are the considerations. Now, I agree with you, Mike, that this was sent back to the DNA subcommittee, and unfortunately, as part of our structure, the only thing we can do is send it back to them again or request of them that they give more extensive answers. But I find this really troubling. And, somebody like Dr. Walsh, would certainly be in a position to understand exactly what it is they're saying is fine and what kind of study they really have. And I'm sitting here and I'm looking at both representatives from the lab, and they haven't given an answer as to whether they have an internal validation study on samples replicating casework for that show that they can get the right answer on mixtures of more than 2 people at less than 25 picograms. Do you have such an internal validation study as defined by federal standards?
Hey Barry, I just have a question.
Are you going to answer it for them, Brian,
No.
or are they going to answer it?
I guess when you say it's defined by...
these questions to them.
Yeah, and I have a problem with the question. I'm not sure I understand what you mean is defined by federal standards. What federal standards are we bringing in here?
I sent letters to them. There is a federal standard, right, on what defines internal validation study, and it has to do with samples replicating casework. I put that in the past communications to the commission that were passed on to the DNA subcommittee. And I want to ask, do you have any idea what I'm referring to when I talk about an internal validation study as defined by the federal standards?
I don't believe there's a federal standard, Barry. There's guidelines from SWGDAM that have things, but guidelines are not a standard. They're vastly different.
Internal validation.
I'm calling SWGDAM guidelines in that regard standards. We'll call them guidelines if that makes you happy.
But that's vastly different.
We all know what we're talking about. There's a guideline on internal validation studies that say you have to be able to demonstrate that a new assay has been validated on samples replicating casework. Your assay is using low copy number testing, the way the OCME, and only the OCME does this, to my knowledge, in the United States, much less the world, right? Do you have an internal validation study demonstrating that you can get correct answers on samples replicating casework at 25 picograms or less with mixtures of more than 2 people? Do you have that or not, Mr. Lean?
Is this a question that I should answer, Commissioner Green?
If you understand the question...
you have to answer.
You have to answer.
No, Barry, he's allowed to ask a question. He did, and I was trying to answer him when you jumped in and started yelling. My response to your question is, if you understand the question and you can answer it, then please do.
He said yes, and I asked, he said, yes, we do. I'd like that produced. Fair enough?
By a date certain.
I guess if you want to make a motion and have the commission vote on whether or not he needs to produce it, you're free to make that motion.
Yeah, I make that motion. I don't know. I don't see why, by the way, I have to get a vote of the commission to produce it.
I don't know how else the commission acts other than by vote.
The commission asks various labs in the past to produce documents, and they have. Why would we need a vote on something that the lab admits it has?
I don't think that the standard is that we let any commission member demand anything they feel like from any laboratory in the state. If you want something and you want to make a motion for it, make the motion. We'll see if anyone seconds it.
You're
We'll take the vote.
you're making me make a motion. You're making me make a
No, I'm
motion.
not making you do anything, Barry. You do whatever you want. I'm not making you do anything. If you don't want to make it, don't.
Let me ask you this, Mr. Lean. Would you produce that to the commission without a motion, or are you going to ask that we have a motion and a vote so you can somehow avoid producing?
You don't have to answer that question. You don't have to answer that question. That's not a proper question.
So I have a question for Jean. Did the DNA subcommittee members who visited your lab with regard to this issue look at the validation studies that you had available?
Yes.
Thank you.
The question's answered.
And were those made public documents to them? I mean, I don't understand why these kinds of validation studies, if they're shown to the subcommittee, are they? Did you at the DNA subcommittee meeting? You guys came in at that meeting with a big stack of documents, right? Did you not, or produce them to the subcommittee? The one that Brian moderated, where the decision was made to go to the lab.
We only came in with a stack of about this thick. All
right, so in other words, you did not come in with that validation study to that meeting, correct?
Correct.
I want to know how this validation study is not a public document.
I can't answer that for you, Barry.
It's proprietary. Well,
It's
proprietary? Who
Why
said
not?
that? Who
Labs
said that?
don't have to produce their validation documents. The DNA
It's
subcommittee has reviewed them.
What's the basis for the statement that a validation study is proprietary in this state? What is the basis for your statement? You have a case? You have a regulation that says that, madam?
When a clinical laboratory develops a new methodology and performs validation, the development of that assay is considered intellectual property and can be claimed as proprietary and is excluded from public disclosure. It's up to the lab whether they want to make it.
Madam, that statement is incorrect. You have no basis for making that statement.
I can tell you that that's the policy of the health department
within the jurisdiction of this commission. If you were correct, then we're not entitled to anything from any lab on the grounds that anything that the lab does can be labeled proprietary or worse, intellectual property as you define that concept. Have you spoken to lawyers who have told you that validation studies in this state are intellectual property?
Marvin, that's not what I said. You asked if it was a public document, and a laboratory can ask that it not be public. That's not the same as does this commission and the DNA subcommittee have the authority to ask for it. Different question.
Okay, I'll take it from that point, Ann. Mr. Lean, is the New York City Medical Examiner's Office saying that your internal validation study is not a public document?
We're just going to move on. If you want to, you can answer.
We will take. If your question is whether or not we will publicize it, we'll take that into consideration, and we will see whether or not we will publicize that on our website. But as of this time, it is not public, but it is subject to review, and the DNA subcommittee has come in to review this, and I think the results are there.
Well, this shouldn't be a black box, right? I mean, given the nature of this inquiry, all that's happened, and its importance, this should be a study that is, if it was produced to the DNA subcommittee, I would ask that it be produced to us and that it be made a public document. I can't think of any reason why a validation study on a controversial assay that affects the life and liberty of all the defendants and victims that come before the courts in New York City for quite a number of years now, how can that not be a public document open for scrutiny and review? It's crazy. Now, I mean, if you're really, are you really saying to me, Mike, that you feel that that should not be produced and made a public document, and I have to ask for a vote of the whole commission on that issue. Is that what you're telling me? Let's just be clear about it.
What I have said to you so far is if you have a motion, go ahead and make it.
Well, no, I asked for production of it.
Yeah, and I said we don't have individual commission members demanding production of whatever they feel like from any laboratory in the state. If we're going to ask for documents, we do it as a commission. So if you feel we should, as a commission, have something that the subcommittee has already reviewed, go ahead and make a motion, and the commission as a whole. I don't get to decide. You don't get to decide. The commission gets to decide.
Well, all right, but I just want to be clear about who's doing what, okay? My first order of business is I asked OCME if they would produce it and if it were a public document. I think what I've gotten so far from Mr. Lean, correct me if I'm wrong, is that this is something that you would, quote unquote, take under advisement. Is that correct?
Absolutely.
So they could do it voluntarily, regardless of your ruling that I need a vote. All right? Okay. Now that you've made a ruling, Mr. Green, that we need a vote on this issue, at this point in time, I'm going to make a motion that they have to produce it to the commission, the full commission, and not just the DNA subcommittee. That's my motion. Let's take a vote on it. How about that?
Does anyone second that motion?
Seconded.
Is there any discussion?
Yes. I would only comment that making it available to this commission does not make it a public document. And if we look at it as a commission, that may be appropriate. But that does not make it public and does not authorize any of us as commission members to share it or use it for any other purpose.
And I guess, Barry, just to be clear, when you made your motion, would you agree that what you're asking for is for the commission members to be allowed to look at it and not asking that it be published or made public?
Well, that actually was not part of my motion, but because other than Dr. Walsh, right, I'm not sure that there is any of it, and Dr. Corrado, I'm not sure that there's any of us that with the specific expertise to evaluate it. I certainly could look at it.
Excuse me.
I guess without debating, the expertise around the table, that is one of the reasons why I think that we have the structure with the DNA subcommittee and people with expertise.
Mike,
but that being said, I just want to be clear on your motion. Is your motion that you want this given to the commission and subsequently the commission allowed to disseminate it to the public, or are you asking that it be made available for the commission only and not be made public as part of any minutes or record or any other proceeding?
No, my motion was to make it available to the commission and to make it public. And I think actually it's Ann's suggestion that it, Ann, is that an amendment that you have that it, no, I'm serious.
No, it was pointing out the fact that technically the materials received by the commission are not for public disclosure by us as individual commissioners.
But
just because we see it doesn't make it public.
Except for the fact that what happens by operation of law with our briefing books here, other than matters that go into executive session, once
public.
These documents are produced for purposes of these meetings, they then become public record.
That's true, but if a laboratory asks that a document be kept in confidence, we would have to keep it in confidence.
No, we wouldn't.
No, we wouldn't.
We wouldn't have to. We could
So
consider
it depends on whether it meets the standards for FOIL. So there may be things in certain documents that may be exempt. So there may be redactions that are needed. So we can't say wholesale it's releasable or not.
But I think we have the clarification we need. Your motion, Barry, is that they produce it and it be a public record and it be available to be disseminated to whoever may want it. That's the motion we have on the floor.
That's my first motion, but I would accept certainly what Gina is suggesting, and that if there are any names or redactions or anything like that that would be appropriate under these circumstances, that be done. But
I don't think
I'm finding it really upsetting that this is even an issue, Mike. I have to tell you.
But note that under FOIL, they can ask that a proprietary document be excluded. Business proprietary, and I don't know that New York City takes the position that their method is proprietary, but if they were, they can ask that it not be releasable.
Good Lord, let's hope they don't.
As well.
Yeah,
So we have a motion on the table to ask the New York City Office of Chief Medical Examiner to provide any, I'm assuming LCN validation studies that they have to the commission with the understanding that they would be made public. And I believe, Marvin, you seconded that motion.
With the further understanding that if they have to redact any things that would ordinarily be redacted pursuant to FOIL requests to protect people's privacy, that's perfectly okay. But the idea here is to try to get the scientific data so that presumably were shown to the commissioners. By the way, were they given copies? Dr. Walsh's question, were they given copies, or was this just something that they looked at during the course of the tour, which took how long? What's the answer to that, Eugene?
They came to our laboratory. They were afforded the entire day or more to review any of the validations, and they reviewed validations.
Did they take copies of it away?
No.
All right.
Did you review with them the internal validation study that's the subject of this motion?
We were at their disposal in terms of what they would like to see,
and
they were left to conclude. And
my question wasn't who's at whose disposal. My question simply is, with respect to this internal validation study that is the central aspect of Mr. Scheck's motion, did you or any of your colleagues engage in a discussion with the members of the DNA subcommittee with respect to the internal validation study? Or you did? I'm sorry?
Yes, you did.
Okay.
So, is it a clear enough understanding, Mr. Lean, with respect to what might be redacted in terms of name, any other privacy considerations? Do you have any other concerns that the request that I'm making would be an invasion of somebody's privacy? Or something that we should be concerned about for security purposes versus just trying to get out on the table what exactly you did with respect to validation and whether or not it is adequate scientifically. Is there anything that I'm missing here that you need to redact before you decide whether or not you want to disclose this?
For all public documents, we reserve the right to redact any personal information.
Okay.
I think that's understood, but
right.
I'll wait for the vote.
All right. So are we all clear on that, Mike and Gina? Is that?
So we have a motion and we have a second, I believe, right?
Okay.
Is there any other discussion on the motion? All in favor? We have 3. All opposed? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So that goes down 3 votes for, 6 votes against. Do we have any other motions with regard to this agenda item? All right. Thank you. I'm sorry, we have another comment here. Dr. Corrado's got a comment first.
I'm sorry. I guess, Barry, I just want to ask you, I've listened for a number of commission meetings. You've expressed a lot of concerns about the low copy number. But it's my understanding that your agency, the Innocence Project, continues to support the use of it. So I guess I'm kind of confused. If you're that concerned about the use of low copy number, why is it that the Innocence Project continues to utilize it?
That's simply not true. The fact is that there were some cases, and in terms of the amount of DNA, I don't think it fell below the levels that are in question, but that doesn't even matter. The answer to that question is, right now, particularly since it can't go into the ENDIS database, right? Any case that we have that would have this low amount of starting material, right, we will want to get a DNA test by a laboratory that has that is CODIS eligible, right, but is not using the low copy number technique. I would advise any lawyer in New York City or the United States not to utilize this technique, right, because you're taking a chance on something that, by vote of this commission today, right, you have said we can't even see the internal validation studies that show they can get these results on casework. Now,
I don't think the vote was that we can't see it. I think the vote was that we and the public.
And Barry, I mean, there is a case.
I'll make another motion. What?
Can I finish first, and then you can do your motion? I just want to let you know that maybe you need to talk to some people in your office, because we have a case in our jurisdiction right now that the Innocence Project requested we send to a private laboratory for low copy number testing. So
no. Let's not mix things up. We are not opposed to different kinds of techniques that would fall under the rubric of low copy number testing. What we're talking about is the methods used by the Office of Chief Medical Examiner, whereby they take the samples to chop them up into 3 different pieces, and then make a judgment that if 2 out of the 3 samples have the same alleles, that they'll make certain kinds of calls. It is a technique that, as I understand it, is unique to OCME. It is under what I've seen of it is extremely troubling, and what I haven't seen is an internal validation study of that technique. So
that's still confounding, though, because are you saying the exonerations the OCME has done are invalid? Because they've done them, right, Eugene? Sorry? Have you done exonerations for the Innocence Project? Eugene?
But would you name? When you
the answer is yes. So are those invalid? Because if you're concerned about it, it would seem that would be a natural extension.
This is all kind of hypocritical point scoring. When you're talking about a particular case and a particular technique, all right, we'd have to see it. But when you're talking, Dr. Corrado, as you well know, that there are different so-called low copy number assays used by certain laboratories that are different than OCME. So I don't know what you're talking about in terms of cases that you're doing. We regularly use the Cellmark laboratory and other laboratories that have techniques that would be characterized in quote-unquote low copy. They are not the same techniques as OCME, and they've been validated.
But I mean, the New York State DNA Subcommittee reviewed the OCME's validation and approved it and said it's sufficient. I don't know that they've reviewed these other private companies. So my only point is, I think to me it seems like a double standard that you're okay with certain people doing low copy number and not others, and I just don't really understand it. But that I don't really need to say anymore. Thank you.
No, it's not a question of a double standard. We're very, very clear about this, and that is. The validation studies for something when you're using extra cycles or smaller amounts of starting material, there have to be internal validation studies on samples that replicate casework. Those have to be public. They have to be available for scrutiny. And I'm befuddled by the fact that so far this is not public, given all the controversy around it. I will make another motion, my final motion, right? And that is that I would ask that we take a vote on this internal validation study being made available to us as commission members.
I just want to make a comment before I vote. Actually, it's got to be seconded, right?
Do we have a second?
Seconded.
Just a point of discussion. As a person that's been part of this from the beginning, I found that the review has been exhaustive, and I think this keeps coming up and coming up and coming up. And I trust the experts on this. I think Harvard and Yale essentially have signed off through Dr. Bieber and Dr. Kidd, and I think other people that are significant in the field have looked at this and looked at it in great detail. So I'm not going to vote for it. I'm not going to support this.
I'd also like to make a comment.
We have another comment first, Barry.
I just would like to say that this is not so much a vote that we don't want to see it or we do want to see it. In my view, it's respecting the DNA Subcommittee's work and their expertise, and if they have reviewed this recently, then I think that's sufficient.
Well,
Any other comment?
I mean no personal disrespect to members of the DNA subcommittee. They're lovely people, but there were some of them there that frankly had never done and said on the record that they had not done this kind of review for forensic matters. And I was concerned that they did not even engage the dissenting opinions of former colleagues. And it's not a question of disrespecting them, Dr. Walsh. I have respect for all of them. But in terms of process, I found the discussion that was conducted there lacking. And, look, I don't want to – I can say something about this that I would like to reserve a right to say something about this in executive session, because I don't want to say something in public about it, but probably something that you all need to know. So
Any other discussion before we vote?
Yeah, okay, no comments.
All right, any other discussion before we vote on the motion? All right, all in favor?
This is to make it available just to us, right?
Correct.
We have an understanding of what it is?
Yes.
All right.
And we're missing Superintendent D'Amico.
He's not available.
Now, how long is he going to be unavailable for?
I don't know. He just told me he's not available. Want to take 5 minutes?
No, we'll just continue the vote. Anyone opposed? All right, so that's 5-3, so that motion fails as well. All right, thank you. Our next order of business under old business is an update regarding our hair evaluation. Brian?
Sure. At this point, at the direction of the commission, letters were sent to all the laboratories. The laboratories have been advised to essentially identify the first positive inculpatory cases having to do associated with rapes or homicides for 1980 to 1990 and 1990 to 2000. They have till November 14th to do that. We're going to see if in fact they're not able to do that, then they have to give us the rationale as to why they can't and what obstacles that they encountered. So at this point, there's 2 jurisdictions that indicated that during that time frame, they were not performing testing, but another agency that doesn't fall under the purview did. Nassau County and the Syracuse Police Department. Letters have been forwarded to those agencies as well. So at this point,
Have we heard back from? Have we heard back from Syracuse and Nassau County?
We have not.
Well, is there any inquiry going on as to how difficult it is? Bob, how hard is it for Suffolk to comply with this? Or?
We've put in about a week's worth of time-wise, about 35 hours. We looked at about 280 cases. We have identified about 6 right now, and that incorporates from 1990 to 1996. We still have to do the remainder of the 90s, and we still have to go back and do the 1980s.
Okay. I'm wondering if any of the lab directors here could tell us how it's going and if there's any particular difficulties, because I know that we've contacted the Attorney General's office who have some people there that are interested in providing some assistance to the review and maybe even some resources. So I want to make sure that, this is on track. Dr. Corrado, are you having trouble complying with this?
No, we're working on it. It's a little bit simpler for me because I'm really only focusing from 2000 to 2012 or 13, whenever we stopped. And we have electronic records. We have a LIM system, so we're working on it currently.
I wonder if Westchester is having problems here?
Well, our cases always went to the FBI. They just recently actually contacted us, which I forwarded the letter to DCJS regarding a homicide case that they worked on, and we provided them with the prosecutorial information they needed.
What other laboratories were doing the hair? Is there anybody else here? How are you guys doing, if you could report
Speaking on behalf of Major Monroe can fill in my blanks, but We should be able to comply only because we had a massive previous project that summarized the homicide cases. So with respect to homicide, we can draw on a database that was full. We haven't actually complied yet. One and done work because
But it looks it's on track, huh?
However, if we go further, it's going to entail a massive amount of work because we've got everything is on paper, predating electronic databases. So we should be able to comply with this one, but anything additional will be extended. That's fair to say, Major. Yeah, and the complex piece will be if we have to go into the non-homicide cases.
Is it doable?
Anything is doable.
Right.
The problem, if we have to go into the sexual assault cases, will be identifying them. Our system didn't identify hair cases. So I will have to look at every single case, every single box that exists. So that's monumental for us. The records are kept, but the crawl through them would be extensive.
Just so I'm clear, because I want to understand that. So if you have a box of 70 files from the 1980s, you pick out the first file. There's no indication on the file if there was a hair analysis done in that case.
No, there's actually 3 ways a case could be classified. You have to open a file, look at it, and as I recall, it could be classified as a criminalistics case, a microscopy case, or potentially a serology case. So that opens the field to, I think there may only be like 10 other choices. So it's a very large population that we have to do an accurate review. We'd have to look at each one of those types of cases.
But that within your own system, there are those 3 that are classified.
Right.
So if you're in a file, a box of say 50 cases, if you find 40 cases that are not in those 3 classifications, those 40 are eliminated. It's just the others that you got to. Although you're saying those others still forms a large population.
Vast population of what we do.
Let me just ask a follow-up question. With respect to this large population, is there a way when you open the file using your internal 3 classifications that you can tell if it's a hair case?
At that point, once you look in the case file,
Right.
it's case by case, and you'll actually have to physically
You got to go through the papers. And is it clear to you that if you do go through those papers, you can find something that says hair? There's a report.
Documentation will be there.
Okay.
It will be written, but it will be within the case file on paper, which is kept on site.
Thank you very much.
Yeah. If you may recall, I notified the Commission last year that we had water damage to a number of our records. So we're still trying to meet the deadline of November 14th. But we've identified 4 cases at the moment. The one thing I might ask for clarification though is that in the original Commission meeting, it was discussed of 5 cases in the 80s and the 90s. But in the letter, it was specific that it said start at the beginning of the decade and 5 consecutive cases. I may have a problem with that because some of the boxes that may not be recovered might not be from the beginning of the 80s. It might be the middle. It might be the middle. It might be whatever we can actually.
What you can find.
We can find. So just wanted to update you on that.
But in the spirit of compliance,
yes,
if you were missing, you would go forward.
No, we're going forward. No, we're going forward. No, I just want to let you know it may not meet that specific, the specificity of the letter.
And Dr. O'Neill, I think the rationale behind that was that the labs, they were trying to get a feel for, if there is an issue and how big the issue is. So they're trying to say, look at the first ones as opposed to just random sample. But obviously in your circumstance, what you're doing seems appropriate.
Thank you.
All right, any other discussion with regard to our hair comparison? I assume that'll be on our next agenda as well.
That's going to be on our next agenda, and the results from the labs getting back should be on that as well.
All right, thank you. All right, next we've got a letter from the American Association for Laboratory Accreditation dated September 15th, 2014, asking us, in essence, if I understand it correctly, for a revision to 9 New York Code of Rules and Regulations 6190.3, basically to allow them to either compete or do inspections along with ASCLD Lab I think in one form or another, we've discussed this issue, a few times before as a commission. But you've got the letter, and I'd certainly open it up if anyone has any comments at this time.
I have some questions. The first question is, the first line of the letter says, "I'm writing to ascertain the status of my request made on February 3rd, 2014. And I remember when they came here, or they wrote us a letter, and they asked us about this. Did we not respond to them from February of 2014 to this moment? Did we not say anything to them?
I don't believe the commission has ever taken action, Marvin, and I'm not aware of any commission action that we've taken since February 3rd, 2014.
Okay. So what is the issue here, so I could figure out why we are wed to only one accrediting agency in the state of New York, specifically Askeladd Lab? This letter, if it's correct, this letter says that they offer more services than Askeladd Lab does. So my question is, what is the problem? Is there some dissent here about opening up New York State to valid, approved accrediting agencies other than the ABF one, Askeladd Lab? Is there a problem that I'm not aware of or I'm missing?
I guess the first thing I'd say is we're not wedded to one. By our regulations, we've set out in our regulations that we'll use either Askeladd Lab or, in certain instances, Askeladd Lab or ABFT.
Right.
One of the issues that I see, taking, for example, a forensic DNA lab, Askeladd Lab obviously has certain standards that they're inspecting to. If we open it up, and this goes beyond just this particular agency, if we open it up to any other agency, the issue becomes what standards are they going to inspect to? And then you've got to look at how this looks from a laboratory's perspective. And I think the laboratories, it would seem to me, want to have some certainty from, I was going to say year to year, but that's not really fair. 5 years, 10 years. I can't imagine lab directors want to be in a position of meeting, one set of standards this year and another set of standards 2.5 years from now and a third set of standards 5 years from now. So, I don't think any of those things are insurmountable hurdles in using someone else, but I think they're very serious issues that we need to consider before just throwing the door open and saying, hey, anybody who wants, come on in here and knock yourself out.
Yeah.
Well, isn't it correct? I'm sorry. Is not somebody else? I'm sorry.
Just had a question in their previous interactions with the commission. Did they describe the credentials of the people that would be doing auditing of the labs, for example? So it's one thing to go through standards, but certainly get more out of it if you have a background in that area.
Mike, I guess, from a laboratory perspective, I think there's a couple issues, and that is when they speak in this letter about offering, as you pointed out, the 17020, the 17025, the CLIA, there's 170-211. I mean, those are all different standards. Right now, the Askeladd Lab uses the 17025, and then there's an Askeladd Lab supplemental. So, first of all, if you open it up, you would have to, I think this commission would have to make a decision, are we saying it's okay to be 17020, or do we want everyone to be 17025? So that would be an issue that would have to be addressed. And I totally agree with what Mike said. I think as a lab, what we're going to see is if we were to open it up, I'm not saying we should or shouldn't, but if we were, and there's say 5 options or something, the counties or in the state, whoever, will go with the lowest bidder. I mean, we're obligated when we send things out. Unless you have a reason why you cannot use somebody, it's going to go to lowest bidder. So that means every time the lab is up for accreditation, they never know which standard they're trying to meet. So while it might, if we even said we're all going to be 17025, there's still the supplemental. So that would be different every time. And for instance, some of the other agencies out there don't really use the same uncertainty requirements, say that ASCOD Lab currently does. They're a little looser on that. And there's a lot of differences between them. So I think that if you were to consider changing it or going outside of the one that we currently have in the law, we kind of would need to kind of pick one or stick with one so the labs would know what they were going with. And I also think the problem is if it goes with low bidder, and it goes out to different places, there's less consistency. I mean, we're talking about report standardization, wanting to be uniform, and here we are saying there's going to be no uniformity in the type of accreditation standards the labs are held to. I think it'll be hard for the lab. I think it would be hard for the commission to review different things if there's different standards. And my last concern with the low bidder is just that, is low bidder. And I'm not saying which agency is better than another, but I do think that it scares me at times to think that we might be going with the low bidder. We might not be getting the best product, like what Ann said. We don't, if we don't know what the inspectors do or who they are. So I think it really would require a large amount of research to look at what are the options, what are the different standards that the different groups have. I think you'd have to, compare them. You'd have to decide where you want to go. And by the time you do all that, I don't know, are these companies going to be the same? Are they going to merge? Are they going to be different? So I just think there's a lot. And the last thing too is that if the time between your audits is 4 or 5 or how many years it ends up being, I don't know how that would work, because if you want to have like surveillance or midterm audits, you'd have to stick with that one. So you'd almost have to get the bid for like an extended period of time, and I don't really know how you would do that. I don't know how the counties would do that. So those are just my concerns that I want to express.
Let me just respond by saying that it seems an anomalous position to take, that we won't consider other agencies unless we find out all of this information about them. But from February of 2014 to this moment, we didn't respond to these folks, number one. Number two, if you want to know that information as to what their standards are, what the standards are that they're using, who the people are who are going to be the inspectors, and what their organizational chart looks like, then the easy thing to do is to invite them to come before this commission so we can make that determination. That's number one. Number two, it doesn't necessarily mean that if you have competition that you're going to, as a lab, go for the lowest bidder. I mean, I think that's a very cynical approach. Many of the labs are not going to do that. The labs are concerned.
Marvin, I need to clarify. I wasn't saying the labs are going to go with the low. I'm saying we're held by the procurement policies of our own counties. I can tell you, I just had a DNA audit that we had to put outside. We put it out for bid. There were 3 companies that bid on it. The county went with the lowest bidder. That's what they do. They're sort of, that's in their policies. If there's nothing different between them that you can articulate with that, you can say this one offers this and we need that and the others don't have it, they will go with low bidder. I'm not saying the labs would choose that. I'm saying that's unfortunately the procurement process.
I don't know that in the 62 counties of this state that the procurement policy is to always go with the lowest bidder.
That's a state procurement process. That's a state procurement process.
Can I just finish? And then I'll take all the corrections that you'd like. I don't think that the procurement process governs what we should be doing. What we should be doing is trying to determine, are there other organizations out there that do a better job than ASCLAD Lab? If there are, we should consider them. If they're not good, we shouldn't allow them into this state. That seems to be the central issue. The commission's response, or at least I should say the leadership of the commission, Mike, that's you, has taken the position from February to this moment not to respond to these folks. So my question is, why can't we call these people in, have them appear before us, and let's ask them the very questions that people are concerned about? And by the way, it seems to me that most of these organizations, like A2LA and some of the others, have pretty much the same model as ASCLAD Lab with respect to 5 years, ISO standards, and they would have to pretty much toe the line with respect to that. Easy thing to do is, since in this state we have mandatory accreditation and we've mandated that there have to be yearly reviews, in addition to the 5-year review, then certainly that's not a problem, because whoever we let in, A2LA or anybody else, would have to agree to abide by this commission's rulings, which, by the way, is what Askeladd Lab said when they've appeared here twice, that if the commission enacts a rule, they will abide by it, regardless of what their rule is. As to the standards, Dr. Corrado, I point out to you that measurement of uncertainty, which was a standard in existence for over 100 years in science, was not a standard that Askeladd Lab enforced or asked its labs to even do. And when Askeladd Lab was finally called upon that by ILAC, right up to the very end, I think it was June of 2012 or July of 2012, continued to try to convince the international organizations that the measurement of uncertainty should be done, but if your customer didn't require you to have it, then all you had to do was submit a letter to Askeladd Lab during the inspection process. And once Askeladd Lab had that, then measurement of uncertainty, calculated or not, would not have to be dealt with. That was rejected by the international accreditation body, and eventually Askeladd Lab had to adopt it. I think it was in December of 2012, and that was the standard that they set. A standard that had been in existence for over 100 years. So it doesn't seem to me that I'm so worried about the standards of Askeladd Lab. As you know, Dr. Corrado, I have written about this, and I have been a foremost critic, along with other people, of the Askeladd Lab model. There are other organizations to be considered out there, and we ought to take a look at them. I don't think the way to deal with the issue of competition is to get a request in February 3rd of 2014 and to ignore it all the way up until this moment. So I'm asking, and I guess everything now has got to be done by vote, is let's bring these people in here, A2LA, and let's find out between February 3rd and today what their standards are, particularly as to 170.25. Let's find out if they have standards that are comparable or better than Askeladd Lab, and let's see who they are. With respect to DNA, Askeladd Lab uses the FBI's DNA standards. My guess is that's exactly what A2LA does, as well as other major accrediting organizations. I'm not sure, but certainly the way to find out is to ask them. So that's what I'm asking. Let's bring A2LA in here, and let's express our concerns, and let's bring up the issue of low bidder, and let's ask them what their standards are, face-to-face at a meeting. And then we can take a vote and say that in the state of New York, we are going to allow other organizations to do accreditation, or we're not. But I don't think that's an unreasonable approach.
Do you propose just to bring A2LA in, or do you propose to bring in the other organizations out there as well, put this open to anybody who does this service?
Michael, for me, speaking only for myself, the request here is from A2LA. That's who we should deal with.
We've
if
actually
other
had
organizations
requests.
Want to come into New York State and make a request to this commission under our rules and under state statutes and New York rules and regulations that are statutory, then let them write us a letter.
I believe we've had at least one other group come in here and make a presentation, and in fact, A2LA and I believe that second group made that request to the commission, and I don't remember you ever making a motion or having a motion pass saying that we wanted to take this action before. So I don't appreciate the personal attack that you're making here, Marvin. That being said, if you want to, Marvin, that being said, if you want to open it up, I certainly have no problem with us as a commission looking at this issue. But what I'm suggesting is, that I don't think it's a 10-minute presentation. If we're going to bring people in and we're going to look at this issue, if we do it the way you suggest and we say, okay, just because A2LA wrote us a letter today, we'll bring them in and we'll make a decision between A2LA and Askeladd Lab, and let's say we pick A2LA at the end of those presentations because we say they're way better than Askeladd Lab. Next week, when the next organization writes us, or next month or next year, do we then repeat that process again? And then the year after, when another organization writes us, we repeat it again, and our labs are in a situation where every year their standards changing? Or if we're going to tackle this issue, do we tackle it once and for all and throw the door wide open for anyone who wants to come in? I think if we look at this realistically, we're going to have to block a day off to do nothing but this, maybe more, frankly. If we're going to intelligently review with these different entities, who's going to be doing the reviewing, what standards are going to review to. As we've heard, it's very easy to say, okay, we'll pick 17020 or 17025, but that's just part of it. Then there's all the supplementals, and so I have no objection to looking at it. I really do think that there's value in making sure we get the right company, but this isn't something we do lightly or off the cuff. I think we've got to be prepared for the fact that this is a very long process. It's going to take a lot of time, and if you and the other commission members say that you're prepared to invest that time and energy, I think in fairness to the labs, we have to do it in a way that settles this once and for all. This can't be a year after year issue.
No, wait a second. As a point of information, even if there's an entity that we deem sufficiently qualified such that they can be available to counties under 9 NYCRR 6190.3, right, to do accrediting, right, we still have to accredit labs ourselves as a commission, right? I mean, there's an underlying assumption, Mike, in the way you pose this, which is that what we need to do is have only one accrediting agency for New York State, right? Maybe one for toxicology and one for other lab functions.
The only reason for that assumption, Barry, was the arguments that have been made before, which frankly I find persuasive, but if other people don't, we certainly can, have a menu of 5 or 10 if we want, but, what Dr. Corrado articulated before, about the fact that, A, you're going to have different standards. Each of these companies, in addition to the main standard, are going to have their own supplementals. And even if you didn't, even if you had one standard, if you've got 5 companies accrediting to that same standard, there's going to be differences in the way those 5 operate.
Right.
Well, I just personally, I don't think that's fair to the labs to put them in a position. You've got the bidding issue. So I was making an assumption, but that's by no means the only route. Right. If someone else on the commission says we should have 5 or 10 groups that do this, we could throw that option on the table too.
Let me just address that, because the answer to my question is yes, you were making that assumption that in theory there should be one accrediting agency for these different kinds of entities. What I'd like to point out to you is that number one, the only reason historically that we wound up with a system where we had we said that to get our final accreditation, you had to at least get ASCLD Lab accreditation, and we might not, even in that instance, give you New York State accreditation. And as we saw with the fiasco that we had with Nassau to some extent, we weren't paying sufficient attention to what ASCLD Lab was doing. That was because when we started this commission, as the first commission, ASCLD Lab was the only game in town. Now, I come at it from the perspective of I have been disappointed in many instances. I hope everybody else was, certainly looking at the Nassau situation and other instances, that maybe ASCLD Lab wasn't actually doing as good a job as they should have been. And we have to make a distinction. I think Dr. Walsh was putting her finger on it when she said, well, who are the people? There's a distinction between these ISO standards, which are, frankly, at this point becoming international, right? There are those standards for accreditation, and then there's the entities that actually go about doing the inspections and enforcing these standards, okay? So the question, and I take your point, we have to decide ourselves as a commission and to make sure that our labs are getting fair notice and adequate treatment and compliance is easy, whether a system that had more than one accrediting agency, as long as they met other kinds of requirements that we as a commission set out, that might be better. Okay? In other words, we made AskGlad Lab, or we certainly asked them, and I take it they did, conform to the requirements that we had in terms of our meetings so that we could get the reports in a timely fashion, right? So I take your point that there's a need for regularity and there's a need to make sure that the accrediting agencies do something that fits into our regulatory scheme as this commission operates and reviews what they're doing. But I come at it from the point of view, I share Dr. Corrado's concern. I don't want the low bid cut rate accreditation entity coming in because I agree with her that counties are always going to go for the low bid no matter what, right? And it's our job to make sure that that doesn't happen and that we have the highest quality group doing the actual inspections and accreditation. But my concern is that I want to find a way to get the best ones. And I think the best ones you ordinarily find by having competition. So I would support your suggestion. We open this up not just to A2LA, but make it known in the community that this state is interested in hearing from different accrediting agencies what they have to offer, how they would do it, right? So that we can consider putting them in play, so to speak, by having them possibly be authorized under the NYCRR 6190.3 to do this. But having said that, it seems to me only logical that we want to encourage competition to make sure that we get the highest quality. And we always are in a position of making sure that it's not the cut rate people, because we can make people comply with our scheduling, and we can say, we can create certain kinds of minimal standards that would really prevent them from offering, slipshod cut rate type services. On the other hand, I'm by no means satisfied that AskGlad Lab has done the kind of job what we want them to do in terms of the way they do the inspections. We've had some bad experiences with them, and we note that all the time. So there might be better qualified people. You've got to remember as well, just as when you say everybody's used to it, right? The problem with these kinds of regulatory systems is that you then develop, quote-unquote cozy relationships with people. I'm not saying corrupt relationships, but I'm just saying, maybe there's some value in having other people come in and look at these labs with fresh eyes. That's all. So I support your suggestion, Mike, that we open this up and that we actually take a considerable period of time where we have adequate opportunity to hear what these people have to offer, because all these standards are beginning to change. And, we would only be sticking our heads in the sand if we didn't, take notice of the fact that we have these OSACs and different kinds of international standards coming, and we should be ahead of the game, not behind it. And I for one, am not assured that AskGlad Lab is necessarily going to get us ahead of the game. So I actually support what you suggested.
Let me just correct one thing you said. I never said or suggested that this should be or would be easy for labs. I just think it ought to be fair for the laboratories.
Can I just make a comment about the process? I just have one concern about the process. I totally agree that we should constantly look at other options, but I think the process this is not a one-day meeting to go through this. And if you just look, this provider is saying that it offers more options, right? 17020. Are you familiar with 17020? Because 17025 is the testing and calibration standard. 17020 is a standard for inspection bodies. And what some providers are using is, instead of a testing result, a professional judgment. So this issue is hard like a chestnut. You have to crack it open a little bit. And essentially what that means is you have to look and say, is a firearms exam of professional judgment? Is that the direction we want to go in? This is not just a bantering back and forth in a meeting. You're talking going through 20 inches of documents in great detail. And while we can cast aspersions to the ASQUAD lab and certainty policy, it is the most robust out there so far. And there's other ones now that don't even shake a stick at it yet. So I think we need to look at these things, but I'm not necessarily sure about the mechanism of let's just have a big meeting to do it, because this is something that can take a lot of time and a lot of effort to really look in great detail. And I think it's valuable to do, but I'm not thinking the best way to do it is to have an open forum discussion like a normal commission meeting.
Yeah, I was thinking that probably another way to tackle it would be, if the commission could come up with a certain set of particular standards that we want to see that are important and how they differ. I mean, in my mind, I need to see a comparison chart of how they differ. If it's proficiency testing, let's say, what is this agency's rule for how often and how many proficiency tests you do, and that kind of thing. I don't think it's a great idea to have salespeople come in, no matter who they're from, and say, oh, we're really good, trust us. I think we need to actually look at how they're different and make decisions of, when we compare them, yeah, we think this is the most robust program, this is the one that we want to go with. So I think we first have to maybe look at issues like proficiency testing and, I don't know, training requirements or, calibration requirements, whatever it is, make some specific topics and what we want to look at, and then do a complete comparison between any of the people that want to submit, their information for us to look at.
Maybe the smart move would be to have a subcommittee, not necessarily composed just of people from this commission, but from but involving other individuals that are knowledgeable and qualified in the field and sort of independent, to make suggestions on how we ought to review other potential accrediting agencies and what the best way to create the kinds of comparisons that Dr. Corrado is suggesting, and I agree, would be appropriate to make an intelligent decision. There's, in terms of getting the best quality review of what may well be consensus standards, right? But the best group to actually perform the inspections. I'm not suggesting that we need a rational system, but it's not necessarily one that is quote unquote easy for the labs. It's one that should be fair to them and should be rigorous. All right. So getting to that point is not simple. Maybe we need if what Brian and Dr. Corrado are suggesting, it's so incredibly complicated, and we can't evaluate just what the salespeople are saying. Maybe we should form a subcommittee to make a recommendation on who should present and how they should present it.
Well, I would just recall that when we started this, decades ago, we did consider a multitude, not just the current ASQUAD lab. The New York State Department of Health was one of the options. The College of American Pathology was an option. ASHI was an option for DNA. They do paternity labs, but it's the same markers that we use in forensics labs. We've had at least two, A2LA, and I'm not remembering the other, GC, whatever. And NIST has talked about whether or not they were going to come up with standards. I think we could possibly task as a first phase the office, I'm sorry, Brian, with coming up with the list of all the accrediting organizations that have or have indicated they would be willing to look at forensic labs. I think we'll be able to shorten that list. There will be some that will simply fall off that list. And then take a look at what the number of such entities might be. I think it's going to be, large. And then we'll have to decide whether we can come up with some objective criteria like are you an ISO accrediting organization, to further limit the list. But if we're going to seriously consider A2LA, then I think we need to figure out who else, and the format should accommodate comparisons of who we've got and who we're looking at, again, with extraction of data from their documents. And then if there's anybody we still want to look at. But I do think A2LA needs to be told, you know, we haven't moved, we are considering, we'll let you know, as we move forward.
I assume, everyone's mentioned ASCLD Lab, but I'm assuming all of this discussion applies equally to ABFT.
Oh, to anybody.
Anybody.
But identifying the anybody is not trivial. I mean, it's a large.
And I guess in addition to identifying who the universe of possible people are, it would be helpful to have OFS, at least come up with a preliminary framework or draft for us of the different things we should be looking at.
And I think also, Mike, the 17020 versus 25 at a minimum, maybe others.
Right, but also the 15189, it's a whole different standard. And there's three standards that are out there that are, I'm not sure if you'd call them appropriate, there's three standards that are being used. And they are, like, I think 17025 and 15189 are fairly similar. I think 15189 is more of a clinical laboratory standard or medical diagnostic standard, but 17020 is a vastly different standard, and it's one that's really been advocated in the new ILAC G19 document because they were looking for crime scene, because they say as an inspection body, they're making professional determinations about what to collect or what to do, professional judgments. But jurisdictions have used this for latent prints, for firearms, for anything. And the question is, we need to look at the ISO standard, and that is the International Organization of Standardization, so it is an international standard as to what the sum and substance of it is before we can even determine if the supplementals for that standard are appropriate. So there are definitely many layers to the onion, and as we peel them, we will all start crying for sure. But, it's probably something that needs to be done.
Well, I guess, trying to put Ann's comment and Brian's and mine into a motion, then I guess the motion would be that for the next meeting, the Office of Forensic Services take a first crack at identifying the potential universe of organizations out there that we should be looking to. And then secondly, at least come up with a tentative framework or outline for us in terms of the different things that we ought to be looking at.
Just a friendly, what you can call it, a motion. That's a lot of work, and the next meeting is really soon. Do you want to maybe bump it to the one after that? I mean, I don't know. In my mind, you're asking a lot of work.
At least give us a report at the next meeting. Start the work, and let's get a report at the next meeting. And if the report is, here's the universe of people, but we still need to work on the outline. But let's put it on the agenda at the next meeting.
I can identify the providers by December 5th. I think that's reasonable. I think doing an in-depth comparison of those providers clearly could not be done by December 5th. But I think we can at least identify the universe of potential vendors.
Right, and it may not be that great. I mean, we'll see.
Right.
And the process by which we would consider making that comparison is we can consider at that time. But I just want to flag the issue that we shouldn't cavalierly dismiss the idea of having more than one entity accredit labs in the state in similar disciplines, as long as we can establish for ourselves certain standards in terms of what we would demand of them with respect to reporting requirements or other indicia that we think are important. I mean, so I'm really just trying to flag that for you, Mike, that we shouldn't assume that the right model is necessarily just having one entity for each of the, for the toxicology and the rest of the laboratories. I don't know if that may not be appropriate. I mean, the idea of having competition might be useful. We don't want it to be competition that gets the lowest common denominator and the cut rate provision of services, but it might be the kind of competition that actually elevates the quality of what's done and is, helpful and constructive. So I think you have to keep that in mind.
Yeah, and I think that, at least in my mind, to answer that question, there's both the practical consideration of, does one group stand out or not? And then there's the policy issues of, does it make better policy to have one or multiple? And I'm fine waiting on, it seems to me we could more intelligently debate that issue after we've looked at the universe of people that are out there and what they have to offer. Do we have a motion then that we ask the Office of Forensic Services to at least identify the universe of potential entities out there that could provide this service by the next meeting, and then whether it's for next meeting or the meeting after, give us an outline that we can use in terms of things that we need to be considering or asking these entities for to help us make a decision.
So moved.
And what are you going to? How should we answer these A2LA people?
I'll just write them and tell them that it's under consideration by the commission. And that we anticipate that it's going to be a process that's going to take some time, unless someone has another suggestion.
No, I think they get points for asking.
But they're not the only one that's asked. We've been asked. We've had people come in and ask us in person before.
Well, that's useful for us to know. Who is it that?
Who else came in?
Who else came in and asked?
FQS presented the commission in December of the first year I was here.
By FQS.
But that's not what we're talking about. FQS came here. A2LA has asked. Were there other vendors who have come to DCJS? Asking
the New York
to be
State Department of Health, ASHI, and CAP.
That's exactly what I was talking about. Is when they came in and presented to the commission, they presented for the purpose of trying to get our business. They wanted to, that was why they were here to do the presentation.
Right. Okay.
And by the way, I don't dismiss the idea of having the New York State Department of Health take over some or maybe a lot of this. For my money, we made that was a consideration that we didn't reject that because the commission didn't think that was appropriate. That was not something that the Department of Health had the money or was willing to do at the time.
No, that was rejected politically in the statute.
Yes.
As exempting these government labs from DOH oversight. And I think that opportunity has probably long passed. But, it's just another state agency without resource.
So at the next meeting, I'll have something that we can all sink our teeth into.
I think we need to vote first. We have a motion and we have a second.
Who's second?
I didn't.
Oh, okay, thank you.
I think it was Marvin's motion, if I'm not mistaken.
Marvin's motion.
Kathy seconded it. Any other discussion before we vote? All in favor?
Just one clarification. Is what he is going to do is give us a universe of candidates, possible candidates, plus an outline of minimal requirements, or we're going to save the minimal requirements for another day?
I guess I wasn't thinking minimal requirements so much as just a very broad outline of here's the categories of things that we should be considering.
That's fine.
Some of those things, frankly, I think, rather than us as a commission trying to gather all the information, some of it might be appropriate to go back to the people who want our business and say, give us an outline of exactly what you're going to do here. Show us exactly what your standards are. Show us who's going to. Right. But I think just a broad outline of various things we should be looking at and considering. Who's doing the inspections, what international standard, what additional standards, price, who knows what else.
Okay.
All right. I think we have a motion, we have a second, all in favor. Anyone opposed? So I think that was everyone in favor, so no one can be opposed. All right.
Can I just get one clarification? The price thing is probably one thing I won't ask, if that's okay.
Yeah, no, I was just,
Yeah, no, but they're comparative factor, but I don't want it to be.
and then frankly, it's a draft. We're not going to be
Yeah.
bound by it. We're going to give the commission a draft, and I'm sure that there'll be suggestions around the table at that point.
Well, their fee structure is important, because if they're gonna end up always being the lowest bidder, you might
Okay.
not wanna put them on the list.
Just ask them.
Yeah,
Just
what's their
something
fee
generally.
structure?
Yeah. All right, the next item we have under new business.
I'm trying to
is-
get your business. Wouldn't I come in with a lower bid than Askeladd Lab? And wouldn't that force Askeladd Lab to then come in with a lower bid?
I'm sorry, Marvin,
Right,
what's
which
that?
saves us money in New York State? I don't get it.
Hey, Marvin, your whispers are very transparent.
I'm just puzzled by the last discussion. I apologize.
New business.
All right, the next item under new business relates to New York State Police Crime Lab. There's a letter, I think it's the first thing in your binders under the tab of new business, dated September 16th of 2014, to me and the commission from the DNA Subcommittee. It's a binding recommendation with regards to the approval of Global Filer Express Direct Amplification Kit for the New York State Police Laboratory. Any discussion with regard to that letter or that issue?
Could somebody just explain to me exactly what this is?
Okay. It's Ray Wickenheiser. I'm the director of the New York State Police Crime Lab. So what we're asking for is approval for the Global Filer Express Direct Amplification Kit. Within that validation, we also validated a hole punch system. We validated the genetic analyzer 3500 model, also the GMID X software that goes along with that, in addition to the DNA kit itself. We've been notified by the FBI that within approximately 2 to 2.5 year period, you're going to be being the core loci from 13 up to 21. So in order to do that, we're going to need to validate new systems. So we wanted to get ahead of the curve, validate that system, make sure that it was good within our hands. Everything worked out great. So as a result, we went to the DNA Subcommittee, presented that information, and got approval to proceed. So
Who
that's what we're asking
makes
for.
Global Filing?
This is Applied Biosystems within life technology is the
And
only.
is this, is the FBI indicating that they're going to use?
They have approved it as one of two. Promega also has a competitor kit, also meeting all of their standards, also both approved.
Did you look at the
We
Promega
looked
kit?
at both in our hands. We did a head-to-head comparison. It certainly had its merits. In our hands, we felt that this was a better kit of the two.
I'm just curious why.
A little bit better sensitivity, a little bit better stability, a little bit lower failure rate. And again, great kit, great technology. Just in our hands, this one performed a little bit better. So we're asking for approval for its use.
Yeah. By the way, how is it validated when you looked at it?
We follow the DNA.
No.
board
How did they
standards.
validate it?
Oh, there's two pieces to validation. They do a external or validation. I'm just missing the word in terms of very extensive in terms of showing and have to prove to the FBI that it's stable, reproducible, sensitive, and stuff.
Right, and they did that on samples and then they did internal validation.
Well, then
on,
we do an internal
right,
validation.
you did internal validations on samples replicating casework.
Well, in this case, because it's data bank,
You're right.
it's
Well,
going to be pure samples,
yeah,
so
pure
it's going to be
Okay.
unlike casework in that
Okay.
we're dealing with pure samples only for
All right.
database use.
So this is a binding recommendation, so it does require a vote to move on, and otherwise, we can send it back to the subcommittee if we have concerns. So I don't know if there's any concerns at this point, if we're ready to take a vote.
I have one question. When this was presented at the DNA Subcommittee,
Yes.
there was they voted for it, but you had indicated at that time there was one other thing that you needed to do.
Right. And
What was that?
Right, and what that was,
Good memory.
there's an expert system that we
Right.
use to review data. Now, the way the FBI criteria is set up, you need 2 reviews. So those, in many locations, are done by one individual and then done by another individual. We save time and money and it is approved by the FBI for use by using an expert system that can do that second review.
Okay.
It's not necessary, we'd like to put that in, We just didn't get the program in time to run it through to fully validate it. Now, we fully intend to do that and present that to the DNA subcommittee. We just didn't have the opportunity to present that component.
And I think you expressed the idea that you think you'll get that.
Oh, absolutely.
That's going to pass.
That's our intent, and it will pass in my view,
You do?
but we
Okay.
have to show the data.
Okay.
At this point, we have it okay for 2 manual reviews, just not the expert system review.
Got it. Thank you very much.
And by the
Any
way, I'm
other-
not asking for it. You wouldn't have any problem disclosing the internal validation that you did to approve Global Filer, would you? I'm not asking for it, I'm just asking whether in principle you would have any objection to it.
No, it's not relevant to the issue of whether or not we as a commission are going to approve this binding recommendation or not.
Oh, please, come on. You just took a vote that we're not going to have an internal validation study.
That was
made
a
public.
different issue, Barry. We all know what you're trying to do, but the issue before us now is, are we going to accept the binding recommendation or not?
Yeah, I'm trying to get real answers to probably the most serious problem that the DNA laboratories in this state have faced since we began the enterprise. And we've had a vote that we're going to hide the data. Really, really great in traditions of science. Terrific. Terrific moment for the commission. Thank you.
Do you want to come back to that every time we raise a different issue, or
No,
can
I'm
we
just
put that to
saying,
bed now?
You don't want our own state director to say whether or not he would make something public. I have no doubt he would.
Any other questions? All right, if there's no other questions, then do I have a motion to approve Global Filer Express Direct Amplification Kit for database processing use by the state police?
So moved.
All right, do I have a second?
I second.
All in favor? Yeah, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Anyone opposed?
One abstain.
One abstention, all right.
Is it for ethical reasons?
Ethical reasons? State police.
Yeah, that's fair.
Barry, did you vote? Did you vote on that, Barry?
I did.
Yeah.
You vote yes?
Yes.
Okay,
I would vote. I must admit, I don't want to prolong this because I'm assuming that if asked, he would have said, yes, I'll make the validation public. I'm just assuming that's his answer. I want you to be clear about that.
Should ask
Okay, thank you. I appreciate that
You don't want me to ask
clarification.
him that question. You don't want me to ask that question and get that answer. So I'm
Thanks,
just going
Barry.
to assume it for the sake of being pleasant.
Thanks, Ray.
All right, the next issue relates to commission binders. And this isn't anything we need to vote on, but just the idea came up as to whether or not we should try and look to a way to distribute this material electronically rather than in the form of a binder for every meeting. And we just, before we went much farther, we wanted to put that out to the commission and get people's thoughts on, how they would like to get the materials, what would be most helpful. I don't know, Brian, do you want to add anything to that before we?
And I think it's just basically, in this day and age, this is what we're getting. We're getting a lot, and sometimes this is actually a modest binder. They're pretty large. So we're just wondering, and again, despite the fact that it kind of makes sense, there are definitely some obstacles that we'd need to run into, to try and do this and to try and ensure that the appropriate security is with the documents. But we wanted, before we started going through all the hurdles that we had to, we wanted to explore with commission members if that would be something that'd be entertaining, if they are comfortable working in an electronic format with this stuff.
If you send it to me electronically, I have to use a ream of paper to print it.
Yeah.
Okay, but the question is, do you have to print
I
it?
can't review it.
But-
Well, because I review it when I'm here, when I'm there. If it's not in my pocket, it's not going to get read. 10 minutes here, 20 minutes on the train. No, I'm not that connected, all right? The other issue is, I believe there's precedent that says for public commissions, if you move to an electronic format, you have to provide your commission members with the tool, i.e. the iPad, the laptop, the computer, you
Trying
access.
to get an iPad out of this.
I'm sorry that is a precedent that's been followed by other public agencies in the state. I'm not asking for another computer. I don't want another computer. I got enough, but I don't want to get it electronically.
Yeah, I agree, because I take notes on the paper, and I would just be printing it out, making my own binders essentially, which just waste time.
I mean, you could make it that each commission member could say how they would prefer it.
Right. Why can't we have the option?
That would be good.
Save you some.
Yes, I've had commissions where that option is, but here's the real point. And that is, as I understand the way this has worked over the years, and I should understand it since I've been here from the beginning, is that when we get these various different binders and reports, and then we come to the meeting and discuss it, there are certain provisions here, certain information that then becomes public, because at the time of the meeting it then becomes a public document. And the real point is not that, frankly, the convenience per se of the commissioners, although I think that should be accommodated for those who still like paper versus those who like doing these things digitally. I'm not even sure. I personally would want both, but that's a different matter. But the real issue is transparency to the public. That's what this is supposed to be about. We have certain things that we have to keep in executive session, but in terms of science and transparency and regulation, that's what we're supposed to be doing. So when documents come in to us, they should be readily available electronically to the public. That's the idea. So I'm definitely in favor of the electronic transmissions, because that'll make it easier for the public to see what we're doing here.
I have a question. I have a question about the electronic format. If we go to the electronic format, does it in any way affect what we're putting on the website that has to be up within 30 days? All of these documents.
I would not anticipate that it would have any effect whatsoever on that. I would think, and that goes to Barry's point as well, whatever's being posted now and being made public now, wouldn't change at all.
And secondly, could we do this electronic format so that it has a searchable capability? In other words, an index on the left-hand side of the page, so that if we're sitting here at the meeting and you refer to a tab or a document, we can go to the search index and bring it right up on the screen. I think if you don't have that, it makes it really difficult.
I believe it would be possible, and again, I haven't gone through all the explorations, but my understanding is if it's published as a PDF document, we could publish it with appendices and et cetera. It would be Control-F searchable through the entire document for words, keys, phrases, chapter indexes. And again, I haven't fully vetted it because I want to see before I go through the effort of doing that if there is, if it's something that's going to take traction. So if it seems like
this, with the option to any commission member who wants paper to be able to get the paper binder.
Yeah, so it seems clear to me that if we do it, it would not replace the paper. So we'll have to look at this from a workload perspective and see. The idea is to try and streamline the process. If we can do it in a way that doesn't add a lot of work, we'll pursue it. If we can't, we'll just continue with the process we have now.
Okay.
All right, thank you. Appreciate everyone's input. I think the next item on the agenda is lab disclosures. Brian?
Yeah, so there are a number of lab disclosures from different laboratories, and at this point you have all that material in your binders. And I think at this point, if you have any questions, we have the various lab directors from those labs here, if you'd like to discuss them. So if anyone has, the labs in question would be the Erie County Medical Examiner's Office, New York City Department of Forensic Biology, the OCME Forensic Toxicology Laboratory, the NYPD, Suffolk County Crime Laboratory. So those are the ones that have lab disclosures. And again, we have representatives from those labs here if you have specific questions for them.
Well, I have a question for Erie County.
Hold on. Christine Griffin, the new lab director, is going to just approach the table.
Welcome to the commission.
Thank you. Yes.
Hi, Ms. Griffin. Thank you for coming.
Just for clarification, it is Giffen.
Sorry.
That's okay.
Giffen.
Yes.
Okay.
Thank you for coming to the meeting, and my question is this. In the end, as you very candidly wrote, there is no reasonable explanation for this error with respect to the incorrect placement of the vials in the proper spots. So my question to you is, given that there's no reasonable explanation and that the person who did this was familiar with the system, what actions can you take in the lab that would, A, help you to avoid this in the future and might help other labs?
For clarification, this disclosure was actually written by my predecessor, Dr. Osowitz. I have discussed the incident with some people in who this concerns. There were some underlying issues going on in the lab at that time, that a person had retired and the person who made this error had actually assumed that person's duties in addition to her own. So I think, the point is that that there were extenuating circumstances where this happened. I'm also evaluating the review process as to why it was not caught at an earlier incident before the actual case was issued out the door. So that is some of the areas that I'm taking a look at to ensure that this does not happen again.
So will we get a further report from you after you've considered all of that?
If the commission wishes, I can issue another report.
I just would like to see where we're headed with this. This is the kind of error that it does happen. It happens in good labs. The only issue for me is, what do we do to try to continually find ways to eliminate these kinds of errors? It looked to me, based upon your predecessor's report, that the individual involved just had a bad day. And
That's exactly the case.
Isn't that what happened?
Yes, it was.
So I'd just like to make a comment, and I don't know specifically how your system is set up, so this may be difficult, but in general, if you can set up a system where the system basically flags an error in tube positioning, so you set asymmetric blanks in there or something like that, so that if you get a value in a certain well, or in my case it was wells on microtiter plates or whatever, that the tubes have been placed incorrectly. So it's always better to have a system checking and picking things up, and that picks up on some of these human errors that are going to happen because people are human.
Thank you for the suggestion.
I have a comment too. I'm not sure, and I know this was done before your time. I appreciate that. I guess I'm wondering if a root cause analysis was done. I'm not sure that's a requirement of the ABFT program, but I think it would be helpful if you could do that. Maybe when you report back, that would be, basically reporting on a root cause analysis, which would include any actions you're putting in place to help prevent it in the future.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Should we put it on at the next meeting for a report then?
Is December 5th enough time?
I believe it is.
If for some reason it's not, just notify Brian and we'll put it on the following meeting.
Okay.
Thank you very much. Appreciate you coming and welcome.
Any other questions for the labs regarding lab disclosures?
Yes, I have a few questions for the New York City Office of Chief Medical Examiner.
Here they go.
I guess there are a few reports here. The first one had to do with the problem that arose from the cut and paste method. All right, and I understand that one of the ways that you're dealing with that is utilization of DNA profile tables will only be generated using the LIMS system. But looking at the July 24th, 2014 root cause analysis report, and at the very end it says, second, the RCA committee recommended that the quality assurance manager reinforce the requirement that supervisors independently confirm all DNA profiles during technical review, and it says this has occurred. But in terms of the root cause, why did you come up with any implicit in this is the understanding that perhaps supervisors were not independently confirming the DNA profiles during technical review, which I guess is a requirement, yes?
Yes, I'm Meredith Rosenberg, Quality Assurance Manager for the Department of Forensic Biology. It was difficult to pinpoint exactly what happened because this had occurred 4 years ago. So I can't really, doing an independent technical review of the case file is absolutely required, and what I did to ensure that the laboratory was reminded of that is I sent a very stern email to the laboratory reminding them of our accreditation requirements concerning independent review of data. And so what we can do, because I can't speak for what the technical reviewers did 4 years ago, but we do know the initial root cause of how it happened was a cut and paste. Mm-hmm. And so that I can fix. And so the way that we're attempting to fix that is we have placed an enhancement for our LIMS system with this vendor, and they're programming the system as we speak.
Right, well, that made perfect sense. But I guess if there was any concern that the supervisors were not actually individual, that maybe this problem would have been discovered earlier if they were actually following the requirement of independently reviewing them. What, if anything, is the root cause there?
Let me just clarify. The comparison of the profile that was in the table was correctly compared to the data.
No, I understand.
So that comparison did happen. The technical reviewers did do that. What I can't explain is how they didn't catch that the profile was not the correct profile on the table, because that happened 4 years ago. We cannot pinpoint exactly how that happened.
Right. Now, the only reason I'm suggesting that is, and I appreciate what you're trying to do there, but if the workload was too heavy, or there was, there may be an underlying root cause as to why maybe they weren't doing an adequate job. I mean, I see you flag that issue, and I'm just pointing out that
that is a possibility. We have changed our workflow, and our workload is completely different now. So back 4 years ago, it is possible that either of these technical reviewers could have had a heavy caseload for review. Again, I can't really say that for sure. It's a possibility. That wouldn't happen today because our cases are processed within 10 days. So nobody should have a heavy workload at this point. A certain finite number of cases are started at the beginning of those 10 days, and they're finished at the end of those 10 days, and it's been loaded in that way so that nobody's overburdened with work, so that they can take the time to do technical reviews.
On to the second one, and this was the review that I guess arose out of the one locus mismatch review. And I understand that when you're talking about preventative measures, about the first two, the logic check and the interpretation section of LIMS, be entered electronically rather than manually, so you don't have transcription errors. But could you tell us a little bit more about the third issue, which is that STR interpretation guidelines were substantially changed in 2011, and the guidelines call for quote-unquote caution in data interpretation at the long loci due to potential allelic dropout, etc. What do you mean? What were those changes? What have been done to look at other past cases where there might have been this kind of dropout?
So what was changed, and this is an older topic that I think was already discussed with the Commission. I just wanted to remind everyone of that. This was more sent because ASCLD was cleaning house and they realized they hadn't asked us for a formal reply as to the end of everything. So what was changed in our manual, procedural manual, was that anything under 250 RFUs, the height of the alleles seen called at those locations that were under 250, you should be cautious because there may be additional contributors, there may be an additional allele, so you might call somebody a 12-12, but they're not actually a 12-12. There may be a 12-14, but that 14 dropped out because the heights of the DNA were not sufficient to be called at those locations. And so these cases were flagged. I think there was concerning that particular, two profiles, because there were actually additional alleles at those locations. So the profile was called, let's say a 12-12, but it really was a 12-14. But if there were any other cases where that had occurred, where a profile was uploaded and we had made an incorrect call, we would know. Based on their new search criteria, we would know that, and and because of QC checks in-house.
But I'm confused. If I understand what you're saying correctly, is that, and which are the alleles that we're talking about, the long loci?
Yes, exactly.
Which ones are those? Those are, which loci are those?
Like FGA and D18 are very large locations.
Right. So what apparently happened is that these were scored, as to use your example, let's say a 12-12, and then it was actually, let's say, a 12-14, but for some reason somebody didn't call the 14.
The 14 was not detectable by our instrumentation because these locations are so long that if there's any degradation, we won't get that piece of DNA to type. And so if the person is not cautious, they may call the profile or just the first number that they see at that location that was called, whereas the second number could have dropped out because of degradation.
No, so
it's not that they didn't call the 14 was not there.
Oh, it wasn't even there.
It was not
no,
there.
It wasn't one of these things that was just, it was detectable. You could see a spike, but it was just below your cutoff.
I would have to look at the cases to see the actual data to make sure that there wasn't something there, but if there was something there, the analyst would hopefully be more cautious about it. And if they weren't cautious, we have put in our manual now that they need to be more cautious if they see any indication that there could be another peak there.
But my other question is, this particular sample, was this a casework sample, or was this in other words, where did the one, it was, you did, this was a casework sample that the OCME was doing, right? That was just one allele different than what was put into the database. Everything else matched, but this one, is that it?
That one location, yes.
All right.
Correct.
So, did one go back and see in any other kinds of cases? Did you do any kind of retroactive study to other kinds of cases that involve these same loci to see if similar kinds of errors could have been made?
Any case where there could have been potential dropout, but an incorrect profile uploaded would have been detected with the new QA measures that Estes and Ed have put into place with this one mismatch.
Well, all right. What you're saying is that anything which matches on everything except one loci, right, is now going to be reviewed with greater care, if I understand that. But I'm talking about something different, and that is...
They actually went down past one, so it's not even that it doesn't match at, if you have 13 locations, did it match at all 13? They also looked at, did it match at all 12, did it match at all 11, did it match at all 10?
I understand, yeah.
So there's quite a few locations where we could have put in a profile that's slightly different than that it was matched to. And then it's our responsibility to look at those profiles and ensure that there's nothing that we did wrong on our end. Sometimes there just is no, the data is just not there. So
right. I guess what I'm wondering about is, did you go back and look at other casework or do any other kind of studies, validations, or proficiency tests in your lab to see what the frequency was for these particular loci of having this kind of allelic dropout in
No.
casework generally.
No, we're relying on our in-house QC checks for CODIS upload, as well as the state and national QC checks that they're performing. And I think that anything that would have been brought to light would have been done so by now. With that, we're looking, we wouldn't pull all of our case files just to look at the peak height.
Well,
That's not the point of the QC system.
Larry, if I understand your question, we did a validation using the same kit on degraded samples from the get-go. We did not see this issue. We did not do any additional studies after finding this. We felt it prudent to issue caution to the laboratory that might, within longer loci, there might be additional alleles. Should you have only 3 peaks? I mean, if it's a mixture between 2 people and you only see 3 peaks, there might be 1 peak that's not there. So we've issued cautions to the laboratory to say that if you see something that's not there, perhaps it might be something there. So we should not call it a 12-12. We should call it a 12 as an obligate allele with something else in there. So if you're asking that we did additional studies, no, we did not.
Yeah, I would think that this is something that you really may want to look at in terms of, I mean, if you're telling us that you did proficiency tests on degraded samples in the first instance, which are the kind of samples one gets in casework, right? And by the way, were this was with your, not your low copy number, but your ordinary methods,
That's
correct? And then you didn't pick up in your own internal validation, because that's what it is we're talking about, right? Samples replicating casework. You're doing your own internal validation of these particular long loci. Right. You didn't pick up this dropout problem.
No, we did.
Oh, you
did.
did?
Absolutely.
We picked out, this is all part of the degradation study, we picked out dropout.
Oh, okay.
However, if we do additional studies, what if we don't find anything different? I mean, it's still an abundance of caution should be issued to the analyst.
I'm not disputing, I'm saying that
I understand
other than just saying an abundance of caution, you know, shouldn't you be looking at really going back and retesting other cases just to see it, or just doing additional studies that may indicate to you, you know, at what levels you may be getting this for these particular long loci and what else you could do to prevent it?
The mismatch was subjected to all the profiles that were uploaded previously within the years that the OCME uploaded profiles up to ENDIS. Should there be additional cases, we found it in this instance. But for this instance, and along with 1, 2, 3 mismatches to have not revealed anything, I think that's substantial enough for us to be able to conclude that these were the 2 cases that had the primary issue. And that's why,
it was the same loci question.
The loci were what we would call the larger loci, but they were different. The 2 loci were different. But it was this degradation potential was found in validation studies, and the laboratory is aware. They're made aware when they're trained in technical reviewing of their own case that they're about to write up, of the tech review of the data that they have, and comparisons that they're going to make. And in these 2 cases out of tens of thousands, they were not cautious enough at those 2 larger locations.
These 2 cases out of the tens of thousands, but I mean, we're dealing here with known unknowns.
Well, the profiles, the unknown profiles are uploaded to CODIS, in which case they will then fall under the QC measures that they've implemented, which was implemented so to catch things like this.
No, I totally, I really want to be clear about this. I totally get the idea of one locus mismatches, right? Mm-hmm. And that is a QA, QC protection, right? I'm talking about the notion that these long loci, right, have this kind of dropout, right? And what, if anything, could be, maybe you shouldn't even be using them. In other words, if one can be, what one discovers in, when you match it 11 of 12, for example, and then it turns out it's these long loci where you're getting the dropout, right? What happens in a case where you, get 6 markers or 5 markers or something, and then in the long loci, you may have dropout that either prevents you from making a call that it is, in fact, two profiles that are the same, or that is an exclusion, right? You may be missing an allele, which creates an exclusion. So I'm disturbed or concerned about the fact that it was at these long loci. It makes sense that you may have dropout at the bigger loci, right? But why continue using them, I guess, is really an issue if you're having that problem.
It's not a problem. It's just the way that results generate. I mean, if you have a certain amount of input of DNA, there's the potential that you can get a full profile. There's the potential that you might not, based on how many people there are in the mixture. So these locations allow us to have data to make interpretations. If we did not have enough data because there was dropout to compare a profile to another profile, we would not make that comparison. We do not. Or we would say it's inconclusive because there is not enough data because there's degradation in that sample. But not every sample is going to have degradation at those locations. It all depends on how much DNA there is. The DNA that's on this pen from me is going to be very minimal, potentially, and have degradation at those large locations, whereas if you were to scrape my jacket, it would have a large amount of DNA.
Is there any study that you've done in terms of quantitation with respect to how much DNA you thought you had in the first place versus the likelihood of seeing dropout at these long loci? Have you done any studies along those lines?
The studies that, if you're asking whether or not we've done a quantitation study and we've seen what kind of dropout we've seen, yes, we've done studies on that. We have a forensic statistical tool in-house, and we've done studies using different quantitation gradients, and we've seen the dropout rates, and
you actually have dropout rates for each of these different loci at different quantitation. Are those publicly available?
If I request.
All right, I'm going to request that.
Any
you have to have another vote on that.
I just want to clarify, any defense attorney that has requested us, we have not made anything non-transparent. I don't know why, Commissioner Scheck, you are concerned about this. When we are requested, we have produced everything that is required of in terms of discovery motions. So when you ask me whether or not I would give this to the public, yes.
The whole way that the FST program works is you must plug in the amount of DNA that you have, because it's going to use that to determine dropout rates for that profile at each location. That's the only way that it can do what it's doing.
So, I understand that, but I'm just talking about, I'm appreciative that you would make these studies public and available. I remain concerned that when it comes to the internal validation of low copy number, that there appears to be some hesitation with respect to that study.
Barry, I'm going to have to stop you now because we've gone far afield of the issue that we're dealing with right now. If you have other questions on the issue before us, fine. Yeah. We've beaten the other issue to death.
Well, no, we're making some progress on the other issue. And they're related because they have to do with dropout and quantitation and studies.
Yes, they both have to do with fluid, DNA, so they're related in that way too. It's the same lab, so they're related in that way.
No, they're related. They're related to testing samples that replicate casework and what are called internal validation, Mike. That's what they relate to.
We're dealing with a specific disclosure. Do you have any more questions on this particular disclosure?
Well, there's another one that they made, which is, I guess, the September 19th, 2014 disclosure. Now, this again dealt with an issue of the quantitation assay?
Well, the other issues were not quantitation issues.
Well, no, those were dropout issues that had to do with how much degraded sample you had, which arguably can relate to quantitation and dropout rates, just for the record, right? Determining when you have dropout or don't have dropout is a matter of some concern in the profession. Please tell Mr. Green that, because he doesn't seem to understand that these...
All right, we're going to take a 5-minute recess. The commission's in recess. No, the commission is in recess, Barry. When you can get yourself, so you conduct yourself professionally, we'll come back.
I think I'll have to somehow I'll skip that one.
One of those moments where
We have our representatives from OCME back.
Respected.
All right, are there any other questions regarding the disclosures made by OCME or any of the other laboratories?
Yes, I was asking questions with respect to the September 19th, 2014 disclosure with respect to errors made in the quantitation of mixed samples. My first question is, did this quantitation take place in a low copy number matter?
No.
All right. What kind of a matter was this?
Well, the quantitation.
What kind of assay was being used?
It's our quantitation assay. That's solely what evolved from. And so what happened was there that were shifted after putting of the controls. And so for all intents and purposes, it looked like the test worked and that people were given their answers as to if there was enough DNA on their samples. There were cases associated with this quantitation. Some of those cases, based on the quantitation, looked like there was no DNA. And so part of our 10-day cycle now was to report that to our customers as quickly as possible so that they can use that information as needed. And it was 11 days after this test was run that it was realized that there were issues because other cases that should have had DNA did not yield DNA. So samples started to be retested, and then we did a full investigation to the scope of the issue.
Well, all right. I read it. My first question, though, was the quantitation method that you were using here, that's not the quantitation method that you use for low copy.
It's the same.
It's the same with using a LU as the...
Yes.
Okay, so you're using that quantitation method for both your low copy cases or regular cases, right?
All of our cases.
All of your cases. Now, how many cases were actually involved here?
Well, how many cases were on that test batch or how many cases were affected?
Both.
There were only 2 cases that were affected. There were 16 cases on the test total,
All right.
but only 2 were affected.
When you say 2 were affected, meaning 2 that had different results, or?
Correct. So in both of those instances, the initial results for those cases showed that the cases did not have enough DNA to go forward with testing. When we retested the samples from this test batch, we realized that there was enough DNA from those 2 cases to go on with further testing. The cases were sent on for further testing, and we alerted all of the appropriate agencies.
Well, when you indicate here that you just notified the district attorney's office?
Because we needed to know if there was in both of these cases, it wasn't known if the listed suspect was still a defendant in the case, and in the other case, I don't think that there was a listed suspect. But we don't have that information. We need to call the DA's office to determine if there is defense counsel assigned to these cases.
So you're still in the process of trying to determine if there's a defense counsel to notify. You have an intention of doing that?
In one case, there was one one defendant who pled guilty before we even started testing. And for him, we did have a DNA sample. In that same case, there was another defendant. We also had a DNA sample for him, and he was actually excluded from the mixture from that case. And we sent out reports as appropriate for the additional testing. In the other case, there was the police report indicated 2 potential perpetrators, but when we discussed it with the NYPD, they and the DA's office, they confirmed that there was only one defendant that had been arrested in the case, and he had pled guilty before we even started started testing the cases. There is no other arrested defendant at
It
this
would be fair to say that the underlying theme of all of these contacts with the police and the district attorney was because you discovered something and it could affect pending cases where there was a defendant, for example, in jail, and that's why you moved expeditiously, correct?
Absolutely.
What, did you have the police report when you were doing the testing indicating how many different possible suspects there were?
We always have the police, I should say 99% of the time we have the police reports that go with the cases so that we can have an understanding of what happened, especially when there's a case where there's lots of evidence that's submitted and we need to, to determine what would be the most probative to test immediately based on the case scenario. So we use that information to determine if there was a potential defendants in these cases.
Well, one of the issues that's arisen in terms of so-called human factors or cognitive bias isn't there a danger in having a police report and trying to rely upon that in terms of how many people are suspected of transaction versus just doing the DNA analysis, seeing how many different samples you get?
So let's say
Sari,
that
is this related to the disclosure here?
Obviously it is.
Maybe you could enlighten me as to how?
Because there was an error here in terms of whether there was a mixture, whether there was quantifiable DNA, and then whether there was a mixture. And what I guess it's Dr. Rosenberg, Ms. Rosenberg said, is that when they were doing the analysis, and she hasn't, I take it, you're forming a root cause analysis committee. Is that correct?
A committee has met on this, but the formal write-up has not happened.
The formal write-up has not happened. And so the point that I was trying to get at, Mike, is that it is potentially problematic, or could be problematic, that she's now said that they have police reports. She was indicating that they were relying on how many potential...
No. We did not rely on that. When we look at a case...
You knew it.
In a property crime case where somebody stole a car, it doesn't matter how many potential perpetrators there are when it comes to the steering wheel or the gear shift or anything like that, for example. If they say somebody was in the back seat also and drank from a can, then now we know why they swabbed the gear shift, the steering wheel, and they submitted a can, because normally we would just do the can. That would give us the best amount of DNA because the person drank from it straight from their mouth. Why do we need all of it? Now we understand why, because of the contacts that we have with the submitting agencies and the police report. In the case of a sexual assault, if there are 10 men who attacked a woman and we just test her underwear and get one perpetrator, there's 9 other people that may be on the rest of her clothing, and we didn't test it because we didn't know there were 9 other potential people. So we use it to guide us, but we don't rely on it in order to perform our testing. In this case, we didn't use it at all to guide us. The samples that were submitted was a steering wheel swab and a gear shifter swab, because that's typical for a grand larceny case of a car. I needed to look at the police report and the supervisor on the case to determine if there were possible defendants in the case, because now we really need to call the ADA's office expeditiously and find out, has anyone been arrested? We've submitted a report, there's an error, a new one will be coming, we need to let them know that.
Right, okay. The only thing that I would point out that you might be considering, because we had presentations in front of the National Commission on Forensic Science by the individuals that are going to be are members of the Human Factors Committee of the OSAC, right? That when you get you may want to have somebody in the laboratory that reviews police reports for purposes of deciding what samples ought to be tested or not tested, that does not know, that is not involved in the actual interpretation of the testing procedures.
And we did.
Okay.
We absolutely did.
All right. Good.
I have a question.
I look forward to the root cause analysis on this.
Mike, I have a question about one of the lab disclosures.
Yes, Marvin.
The August 15th, 2014 letter, for want of a better term, I call this the vitreous humor letter.
Which letter?
August 15th?
That's for the OCD Forensic Tox Lab?
Wrong people?
All right.
I got it, okay.
Thank you, Meredith and Eugene. And we have Dr. Stajic who can address that directly. Go ahead, Marvin.
So here's my question. With respect to this, and maybe I'm a little bit, I'm out of it. It says Lean signed this. Is that correct?
Well, he wrote the letter.
He wrote the letter.
Yes.
Okay, that's why I was addressing Mr. Lean. But it has nothing to do with this? It's just an internal problem at the OCME, or it's the medical exam?
Well, maybe you can answer that.
That was the reason I posed the question to you guys, because I'm looking at a letter now, and it has your name at the very top, and you signed it.
I wrote that letter in my position as the acting root cause analysis officer of the agency. We've assembled a root cause analysis committee to determine what the root cause is, and we don't have a final report yet. If you are asking about the particulars as of what occurred, Dr. Snyder would be the best person to ask. My name does fall under there because I'm the acting root cause analysis officer.
This is to comply with the New York City
That's
legislation?
Correct.
Okay, so all of the information in here is really Marina Stajic could tell you.
It concerns the Department of Forensic Toxicology and Dr. Stajic can answer.
Thank you very much. So here's my questions about
Yes.
this. First of all, the root cause analysis is still ongoing.
It's still ongoing, yes.
So we don't have a report on that, but one will be issued.
Yes.
Oh.
Within the guidelines of legislation, it will be
Right,
issued.
and we'll get a copy here. I think we're already getting those copies, which is great. Let me ask you this. As I'm looking at this, a new machine was put into play in September of 2013.
Yes.
Okay? In March of 2014, one of the medical examiners, almost, 6 months later, sees a problem with the level of salt, was it?
It was sodium.
Sodium. For us lay people, that's salt, right? But
Well,
maybe not.
it's a part of salt.
Part of salt. And,
salt is sodium chloride.
okay, so it was elevated, and this caused a concern.
We perform the testing based on the request of the medical examiners.
Right.
Don't always know why they're requesting a certain test.
Okay.
And this was the only time that a medical examiner said, well, this was not what I expected.
Right.
So she felt that the results were too high.
Okay.
And that's what initiated.
And in April of 2014, the retesting begins.
The retesting began sooner than that, I believe.
It says in here, the retesting began in April 2014 and involved approximately 80 cases.
Well, that particular case was retested sooner.
The rest of the retesting then began in April?
And then we began looking at all the cases since the new instrument was put into use.
Okay. In June of 2014, which is almost, 2 months after, Mr. Lean was informed that there's a problem. According to this, the assessment of all results generated by the outside lab is still in the process of review. In June of 2014, the Forensic Toxicology Lab informed me of these occurrences, and Mr. Lean signed the document, so the me is him. So
That's
somebody
correct.
informed him.
Yes, because...
Okay. So my question, and then, while the retesting is occurring, in August 15th of 2014, the letter goes out. And I assume this letter of August 15th, 2014 was sent to who? Was it sent to the commission?
That was sent to...
Definitely New York City.
Definitely New York City.
But I don't see anything about the commission.
I can't recall exactly who we sent it to, but I know we sent it to
I know it was sent to ABF.
Okay.
I want to say that it was sent to the commission also.
Right. Can we get a clarification, Mike, if this letter of August 15, 2014 was sent to the commission as well?
Well, that's how it's in
The one that's addressed to me?
Yes.
No, this is received. You can see the received stamps from the Office of Forensic Services on there, and it was distributed in the binders.
Okay. And the distribution, of course, is today's binders for this meeting, which is occurring in October 24th.
Right, which occurred 2 weeks ago when you got the binder, but yes.
Okay. So here's my question. You know, we went through a tough period with the Sarita Mitchell problem, and one of the issues there was, you know, when did it occur, who knew about it, and when did it finally get reported? So my question is, it seems like it took quite a bit of time from the discovery in March of 2014 by the individual medical examiner, which is great, right, before it worked its way to Mr. Lean in June of 2014, and then even further till August when the commission gets the letter. So it's sort of a repeat of the problem we had with Mitchell, where OCME was telling us in September, October, I think it was 2011, 2012, I don't know which date is correct, they appeared before the commission and the DNA subcommittee and reported the incident. But in fact, as we uncovered the information, as the public report showed, there was information going back much further in time that there was a problem. It was known to people. So my question is there some problem with the ASCLD lab guidelines as to when you report this? Or is the issue that you sort of, and this has been my claim, is that when something is found wrong, you don't report it right away in real time, but instead you begin to examine it, do testing, investigation, and then you reach some conclusion, and then it causes you at some point in time to report it. And the reason that this delay between the real time of when something is discovered, in this case the medical examiner said there was an increase in the sodium, is problematic because what if there's a defendant who's been in jail and is awaiting trial? And that was why I asked Ms. Rosenberg a few minutes ago the question to which, in the DNA situation, she notified the DA, she got in touch with the police because properly OCME was concerned there might be a defendant in jail who's being held there while we have information that shows this is not the person. Why wouldn't that have applied in this situation?
Well, for several reasons. I'm not sure that this was a criminal case. I don't think it was affecting any defendant.
Okay.
I don't think there was a defendant. Also, we did check, and the cause of death and the manner of death were not affected at all by these results. In my opinion, frankly, I did not think that this was a significant event, but
others did.
Others did.
Okay.
So I did talk to ABFT. They, knowing the nature of the vitreous humor, the nature of postmortem specimens in general, right, they did not think that it was a significant event. But my supervisor and Mr.
Lean disagreed.
So.
So, Mr. Lean, you thought it was a significant event?
Yeah, I followed the legislation to ensure what is reportable as a significant event as defined by our legislation. I wouldn't say that we disagree. I would say that I followed the legislation to report out the significant events that have occurred within.
But we're still where we were with Sarita Mitchell. The issue still is when, in real time, when you discover something wrong, do you report right away with a letter to the Commission on Forensic Science and ASCLD Lab, or do you postpone the real-time report and delay it while you investigate? And is there any answer to that?
I don't think this has anything to do with Sarita Mitchell. Dr. Stajic is her own laboratory, and she's also accredited by ABFT, not ASCLD Lab.
Right.
So this has nothing to do with Sarita Mitchell.
It has to do with the issue of the ASCLD lab rule.
But we're not ASCLD
And
lab
even
accredited.
under you, under ABFT, there's a rule that you got to report stuff. Now, the question I have is, do you have to report it when you discover it, or do you report it after you discover it and do an investigation down the line several months later? Is it your position, we discover it, we don't have to report it until we're sure of what we've got?
My position is that I would rather do at least the initial investigation.
Okay.
Because the question will immediately arise. So what are you going to, why did this happen?
Right.
I think it's very different from Sarita Mitchell because it had nothing to do with personnel.
Right. This was a machine problem?
No, this is the nature of the specimen problem.
Because the report says that it was a machine problem. So is there agreement between the two of you? Is it a machine problem or is it the specimen?
Problem, when you're talking about problem, that concerns root cause analysis. The root
Right.
cause analysis committee is still determining that.
Whether it was a machine or it's the specimen?
That's correct, yes.
And my last question is this. When a new machine comes online in the OCME lab?
It was validated. If that's your question, this new instrument was validated.
It was validated.
Yes.
And the issue of this vitreous humor and the quality of the specimen didn't seem to affect the machine.
No, we did not have any problems during the validation. It has been revalidated. Since then, we have been sending all of our specimens to our reference laboratory, and then when we get the results back, we are repeating them. And I keep looking at Dr. Kaplan, I'm sorry, because as a forensic pathologist, he may be able to better explain the nature of these post-mortem specimens. Sometimes they're too viscous, sometimes they're discolored, and because you can obviously test the vitreous humor only in deceased people, these instruments are designed as clinical instruments to test serum or plasma or urine, and they don't always
translate.
No, they do translate, but the quality of the specimen can affect your results.
And I assume you have the validation studies for the new machine. I'm not asking you for them.
Oh,
I just want to know if they exist.
Yes.
Mr. Scheck may ask for them.
No, I do, and I even have, not all of it, but I have some of it with me.
That's fine. Great. Thank you. Thank you
And
very
I'll be
much.
happy to share it with Mr. Scheck.
Okay. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Any other questions on any of the lab disclosures?
Can I have a moment, please?
Yes, you may.
Thank you. I have one for the New York City Police Department.
Okay, we have Dr. O'Neill.
Sitting right here. So, good morning, Dr.
Good morning.
O'Neill. So I'm referring now to the August 21st, 2014 letter. I refer to it as the AB problem.
Yes.
You know which one I'm talking about?
Yes.
So what happened here in terms of this AB problem? Because it resulted in a real mix-up.
Yes. So I'll hopefully have a letter sent to you before the next commission meeting. I haven't reviewed all of the root cause analysis committee's findings yet, but what happened, it appeared to be there's an examiner who does limited casework, is actually a supervisor, was performing casework, and during the course of their analysis, when they had to do additional analysis for a case, they went into the wrong case, took evidence from that case, analysed the case as appropriately, documented it on what they thought was the right worksheet, but not the right worksheet, returned the evidence to the evidence where it came from, so the evidence never commingled with the other case, generated 2 laboratory reports. Those were technically reviewed, those were issued, and then when subsequently they were repackaging their case to return to the property clerk, they had a moment and said,
Wait a minute.
Yes. Notified management at the time And what we did was we identified the problem, we informed the district attorney, we analysed the evidence.
Were you surprised it made it through the technical review?
No, because the technical review is a review of the documents, not actually the physical evidence.
Physical evidence.
Yes, not of the physical evidence.
I'm not going to ask you any more questions because you're telling me the root cause analysis is still ongoing.
It's still, I got a summary prior to come to the meeting.
Right.
At this time, there appears to be two root causes. One is inattentional blindness. That's one of the things we look for.
Right.
That's that concept. I don't want to ruin it for you, but there's a YouTube video. Sure. You count the number of basketballs passed between
the invisible gorilla.
And then the invisible gorilla.
Right.
Because the actual evidence packaging was different. It was twist bags in one case, Ziploc bags in another. So you would expect the individual, when they went to take the evidence, they would recognise this is not the packaging that they were previously
Because it's so
working
obvious.
with. Yes.
So it's a cognitive bias issue.
Yes. And then the second issue that we believe is that a supervisor does have other functions, but while they're performing casework, which we're now addressing. We're going to relocate a supervisor to an area of the laboratory where they do not generally supervise those individuals. The analysts will inform not to disturb that particular supervisor. The supervisors do casework on a limited basis. We may expand that because we do like the supervisors to be involved with casework because it allows them to be able to assess their examiners. But those seem to be the primary root causes at the moment. And then I'll be supplying a letter hopefully before the next commission meeting.
Dr. O'Neill, that was great. Thank you very much.
Okay. Thank you.
Mike, I have some further questions on the lab disclosures for the New York State Police. It's Mr. Wickenheiser, am I right?
Yeah, that's right.
Okay. So I read the letter of March 20th, 2014. It's an extremely thorough document. And
here we have more than one disclosure. So
right.
You can maybe know which one.
Really look at this letter of March 20th, 2014. Are we on the same page?
We will be in a minute.
Okay. Here's what it looks like.
March 13th, 2014.
March 20th. Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay. So this was a case where the LIMS evidence tracking system said that the evidence was in the custody of the lab or a technician.
The analyst.
Right, or the analyst. Right. And in fact, as you point out in the very second paragraph of your letter, the evidence was clearly not in her custody and is unaccounted for at this time. I got that part. And then you did the root cause analysis and possible contributing factors, steps taken, and they're all recorded in this very thorough letter. Here's the question that I have. After reading the entire letter and going through it, I still don't understand what happened in the LIMS system. For me, just as an attorney and as a layperson, as I understand LIMS, as its evidence is tracking its way through the lab, people are inputting what they're doing.
Correct.
Right? So who did the input into the LIMS that said the evidence is here, and how come it didn't get corrected?
Right. You're hitting on a key point that was a shortcoming in this case.
Right.
And normally what in the lab is, as you had pointed out, the evidence goes from hand to hand to hand.
Right.
And a practice that this caught was that analysts were putting evidence into a box that was waiting for someone to then process it. So it wasn't done in real time. So that was a shortcoming that had been caught earlier, had been mentioned, but had backslid, for lack of a better description, so that practice had been allowed to go on, which is not a practice that it's against procedure. It's something that we do not espouse because it leads to just this kind of thing. So what had happened was when the person got to those items, went through, there was something that was missing. So hence, to go back to the analyst, now you've got a little bit of a gap in time. Now the analyst doesn't have them, he's supposed to have them, and hence you see the cascade of events where now you start the search.
Right.
And in the end, when something is gone, now to go back and say, well, what happened to it? It could have been packaged in the paper. We're talking about some small plastic bags with
Right.
a very small quantity of substance in them. But certainly the practice itself was halted, corrected, and we put all of the measures you see here into place. But what happened there, really, a part of the root cause is that idea of the evidence transfer was not done in real time. And that led to what we're seeing here, which we have corrected.
What LIMS did do is show the last correct location when the process was done correctly.
Which was with the analyst.
Right.
But clearly, she did not
But
have
she
the
didn't have-
evidence, and it wasn't where she purported that it was going to, and hence we had that gap.
Did you, as part of, I know one of the things that you talked about here as possible contributing factors was lack of a LIMS monitor outside of evidence receiving. Have you now put in a LIMS monitor?
That's since been corrected.
And what
in
is
all
that?
of our laboratories.
In all your labs? And what is a LIMS monitor? What does that LIMS monitor do?
One of the things we wanted to put into place is to have something that we get a video of these kinds of transfers so we can see the actual evidence
A video?
going back and forth.
Very interesting.
That's
so
great.
that we have a record.
Right.
And again, it's not perfect,
Right.
but it's something that if something was to happen, you can go back and actually see what occurred.
And you retain these videos?
Yes, we do. Not indefinitely, but I believe for a year.
A year?
Yeah,
We're still looking at
tried
how
for
long.
18 months, actually.
But certainly, it's going to give us lots of opportunity that when we do back and do various inventories, certainly within the time frame, if something's not right, it's something to go back to and see what actually happened.
But the LIMS monitor, I think that at least in this item that you're referring to, is an actual display that's saying when an analyst or an evidence receiving person is involved in a transfer, that there is a laundry list of items displayed right there. I'm bringing back what I think is 10 items. Hold on, I'm only seeing 9 on the display. Let's resolve this right here.
Right.
And it gets resolved.
If we're just, so I'm curious, because this LIMS is coming up more and more, particularly in trial work, at the trial level in our courts. The computer printout for the LIMS in the state police laboratories, where is that kept?
Now, again, accreditation standards, that can be kept electronically
Right.
or on a document.
Right.
So
It's not in the case file.
well, it's going to be generated electronically.
Right.
So it can be electronically kept. Now,
Okay.
under certain circumstances,
It's our chain of custody document that is routinely created at any request for any case going to trial. Shows the movement of the item throughout the whole
Right.
laboratory system.
Thank you.
Has anybody else done videos
That you know of?
Yeah. Where'd you come out of that? Interesting idea.
Yeah, we've had it for quite a while in the headquarters lab, and we've been able to put it in our other labs.
Thank you.
Any other questions with regard to any of the disclosures?
Not by me.
All right, thank you. I think that takes us to the next item on the agenda, which is executive session. Do I have a motion in that regard to go into executive session to discuss matters relating to either a current investigation or matters that may lead to the appointment, promotion, demotion, discipline, or suspension of a particular person? Do I have a second? All right, all in favor of going into executive session? Anyone opposed? All right, we will be in executive session.
We're back.
All right, we're back. Is Marvin back in?
He's getting everybody.
Coming in.
Okay.
Did you tell him I notified everybody out there?
Thank you. I'll try to bring it back when Peter's here.
We keep being notified that there's somebody else coming in here too.
No, it's the public. You're the public.
They're just finishing up now.
We're done.
And
All
they're
right,
closing
we're
everything.
back in regular session now. Our next meeting is December 5th. We didn't take any action or any formal action in executive session. With that, do I have a motion to adjourn? Second. All in favor?
Aye.
All right, passes unanimously. Thank you, everyone.